Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock, episode 208, part 1. This is of course the Patreon Drydock, so it's going to go on for a bit, but let's get on with questions, shall we? No time like the present. Dave Collier asks, why did the United States give their brand new ship of the line, USS America, to France in 1782? Surely building it was a massive cost to the young nation, and it would have been much too valuable a gift to be given away. What do the French think about it? Basically, I have a suspicion it was a combination of cost-cutting and diplomacy. Because, yes, it's expensive. America was one of the US Navy's various flirtations with actually operating full-on ships of the line for any considerable period of time during the Age of Sail. Obviously, one of the earliest, also not particularly a successful one. Essentially, what happened was the Continental Navy, during the American War of Independence, had faced a lot of similar issues to that which the US Navy would face in the War of 1812, i.e. they'd started out with a bunch of frigates, albeit somewhat weaker than the 6 frigates they'd have in 1812, but they started out essentially with sloops, frigates, and various other ships they'd managed to put together or convert, which was all well and good right up until the Royal Navy showed up with some serious vessels. Thus, in parallel with what would happen later in the War of 1812, the Congress authorised the construction of ships of the line to try and deal with this. 3 to be exact, only one of which would actually end up being completed, that being America. However, again, in parallels with certain ships built in the War of 1812, especially ships that the US Navy built on the Great Lakes, they were in a bit of a rush. They didn't have an established large warship building industry, and so they had to build the ship out of green wood. They didn't have the time to let that wood sit and season, and they didn't have large pieces of wood already seasoned suitable for building a ship of the line. So they rapidly put together this 2-deck 74-gunner third rate, except that even with that taken into account, they weren't able to finish it in time for the War of Independence. So work progressed a little bit more slowly thereafter, and then eventually it was coming up time for the ship to be completed. And during this period, the French had sent their own 74-gunner to go and say hi to their new American friends, because at that point France and the US were very, very close, having just helped collectively throw the British out of the United States. And the French third rate in question, the Magnifique, ran aground and was sunk, which was a little bit of an embarrassment. And so Congress was faced with, well, we've paid for this ship. It's probably either not going to last very long or be a fantastic maintenance hog being built out of green wood. And given that Congress in the immediate aftermath of the American War of Independence tried its level best to basically eliminate the US Navy as an entity, let alone having something as large as a third rate, they needed some way of getting rid of it, but you couldn't just cancel and break up something that carried the name USS America. And so to square that particular circle, they decided, well, in complete and utter gratitude to the wonderful efforts of our French friends and allies in driving out the British, we will present them with a 74-gun third rate to replace the 74-gun third rate they so tragically lost coming to see us, i.e. the Magnifique. So they said, here you go, guys. Here is the third rate USS America. Now it's yours. To which the French were like, thank you, I think. Actually, the old captain of Magnifique, who was still around in the States, waiting for somebody to come and take him home, took command of this ship, so the replacement vessel, and took it off to France, where it could be modified to suit French service. There were only 2 problems with this for the French. For the Congress, it was great, because they hadn't dishonoured the name USS America by preemptively destroying it before it entered service, and they weren't stuck with a long-term maintenance and upkeep bill for a ship that they didn't want anymore. And they had, in theory, improved diplomatic relations with France as well. So for them, it was a win-win. For the French, however, one problem was that the America only carried 18-pounders on its lower gun deck, whereas the typical 74 of this period carried 32-pounders on that gun deck, and quite a number of them also carried 18-pounders on their upper gun deck. America carried 12-pounders there, so whilst it had numbers of guns in broadside weight, this particular sort of country's first starting attempt at a third rate had a broadside weight that was more comparable with a 56 or 64 gunner fourth rate. So it wasn't an especially powerful vessel. And to cap it all off, because it had been built with green wood and then somewhat delayed during construction, it turned out it also suffered quite considerably from dry rot, and it had a very, very short service life of a few years in the French Navy before it had to be broken up as a hazard to the health of its own crew. However, the French were suitably appreciative of the gesture, and they ended up renaming one of their Téméraire class ships of the line, which was also a 74 gunner but had about twice the broadside weight because it carried 32 pounders and so forth, to the French vessel America. And then that got captured by the Royal Navy about 5 years into its service, except it turned out that the Royal Navy also had an HMS America, which was a fourth rate, which from the timing of things they appear to have named basically as a way of getting back at the US Continental Congress for declaring independence, because it entered service the same year that the Declaration of Independence was signed. And they couldn't have two Americas, and the HMS America that was already around, even though it was smaller, predated the newly captured French ship in service, and so they renamed the captured French America. So yeah, everyone had Americas, except America itself, who had given it away to the French. Yeah, confusing, isn't it? Megascrow asks, cross-pollination between tech branches, such as constant speed or variable pitch propellers from aviation, or from secondary battery to land-based artillery. How common was it, and are there any major examples or exclusions? One of the major problems with cross-pollination between naval matters and land-based matters is scale. And the other problem is some of the specialised environments. So when you get into the 20th century, for example, it's much easier for there to be cross-pollination between land and air, especially from air to land, because in the air, by and large, aircraft are at least in the same order of magnitude of scale as land vehicles. And of course they have to design for running in air, the same as on land, but they have to design for lightweight. So the idea of a powerful, lightweight piece of technology that otherwise should function pretty well translates very well into land-based applications. For example, that's one of the reasons why the late World War II British tanks almost exclusively ran on the Meteor engine, which is basically a Merlin with some of the supercharger, etc. elements taken off. So it's basically a down-rated Merlin engine. It's powerful, it's compact, it's lightweight enough that you can get an extreme amount of power out of it, stick it in a tank go fast, relatively reliably, happy days. Unfortunately, the same isn't true of things at sea. Ships are orders of magnitude larger than any land vehicle. And so, yeah, it becomes a lot more difficult to try and get things to translate across. You know, even a U-boat engine is usually larger than any kind of land-based diesel engine that you might find, or submarine engines generally. There is a little bit of crossover between major diesel locomotives and submarine diesel engines, and indeed there is a direct cross-pollination of that in the 1930s with the United States Submarine Service, where they couldn't make marine diesel engines work properly until somebody turned around and said, well, why don't we just take some of the land-based diesel locomotive engines and stick them in the subs? And that actually worked fairly well. So that's an kind of cross-pollination event. However, large as they are, US fleet subs are still, on the grand scale of warships in the first half of the 20th century, relatively small creatures. Whereas, you know, the steam turbine plants on a cruiser or a battleship, pretty much the only place they could have any kind of cross-pollination use on land, or perhaps land technology coming over to being at sea, would be in full-scale power plants. And there are complications that ensue with that. mostly due to the fact that obviously ships move a lot, they flex, etc. These are not things that a land-based power plant has to work with. It's one of the reasons, as I mentioned in one of the earlier dry docks, one of the reasons why Prince Eugen and the Admiral Hippo class generally power plant had so many issues, because they had adapted a power plant that had been tested in a fixed land-based environment, and in part that didn't actually suit very well a very active seagoing hull with all the inherent movements, etc., and space requirements. You're translating back from a ship-based a ship-based turbine power plant, etc., to a land-based one could be done to generate power and so forth, except that because a ship has to change speeds quite often, whereas a land-based power plant, usually generating electricity or somewhat, would ideally run at a single fixed speed, there's an awful lot of elements built into a ship's power plant that are almost useless in a land-based power plant. And, the scale goes on. Artillery, 12, 14, 15, 16-inch guns, relatively common for battleships. The only times you see guns of that caliber on land are either as field howitzers, therefore much, much, much shorter barrel weapons at the lower end of things, or as gigantic rail guns, as in guns that are mounted on railways, which are very large, very infrequent, and very rare. A single squadron of battleships in World War I probably carried more above 10-inch heavy artillery than entire field armies or corps had in terms of available siege railway guns to hand. So, by and large, it's very difficult to directly cross-pollinate. However, there are instances where this does happen. Variable pitch propellers, not so much actually one of them. Variable pitch propellers were known on ships from the early 19th century to varying degrees, and of course variable pitch propellers for aircraft physically couldn't have existed prior to the 20th century, although other experiments with aviation did look at them in the late 19th century. But secondary batteries for ships, i.e. 4 to 6 inch guns going onto land-based artillery, occasionally could happen. Occasionally you could fit such a gun to a tank or something like that. One of the issues with that, however, is that naval artillery tends to be very long-barreled because it has to go long distances, which makes it difficult to use, especially in the 20th century. In the 19th century and the Age of Sail earlier than that, perhaps there's a bit more artillery cross-pollination, but once you get into the sophisticated pre-dreadnought and then dreadnought period guns, one, they tend to be a little bit too long barrel because of the range that they need and can achieve with all their massive fire control equipment, which isn't usually available on land. And secondly, guns at sea need to be built specially in terms of what they're made of, how they're treated, what additional coatings, etc. they have, in order to ensure they don't immediately rust away at sea. And those environments generally aren't found on land, so on land, where you don't need those things, a typical gun barrel of a similar caliber will not only be shorter, but it will tend to be cheaper, even if you adjust for barrel length, because they don't need to include all these things. So putting a cheaper land-based gun at sea can have major issues of maintenance because they'll tend to rust away very quickly. But bringing a naval-based gun onto land will have issues of quite often having excessive range for what you might actually need. Not all the time, though. But more importantly, it will end up costing you a lot more than the equivalent land-based weapon because of all of that we just mentioned. So it's not that common in terms of the major pieces of technology. There are some crossovers, but they tend to be on the smaller scale of things like portable petrol generators and pumps and that kind of thing. Basically, if it's human portable or human scale, there's a much, much, much greater chance of things being cross-pollinated than there is when you're talking about the major chunks of technology, power plants, weapons, armour, etc., etc. Mark Boza asks, nautical fiction in the Age of Sail often makes use of the lieutenant's examination as a plot device, where a board of captains examine a midshipman and determine if he is suitable for promotion to a lieutenant. When did this examination become explicit Admiralty policy? When was it introduced, and was it based on antecedent custom, or was it an innovation? And was it replicated by other major navies, or was it particular to Britain? So it was an innovation, and it came about in the late 17th century as part of the reforms brought in around about that period by Samuel Pepys and his successors, which were frankly needed because by that point the Royal Navy had become incredibly riddled with corruption, which it would go on to become again several further times down the line, but this was a particularly bad phase. The reason why is because at the time there was no intervening rank. So you had midshipmen, lieutenants, and the captain. And this is where you get, first lieutenant, second lieutenant, third lieutenant on larger ships. Later on, obviously nowadays you have the rank of commander and lieutenant commander, which is inserted in between the two. But at the time, that wasn't the case. So that's why you have a first lieutenant on a ship, or a first lieutenant for those of you over in the States. But prior to this introduction of a requirement to become a lieutenant by exam, there were no qualifications other than hold a commission and be friends with a captain who will appoint you to his ship. And since it was possible by various means to purchase commissions, that's points directly, in other times later on indirectly, you could become a lieutenant, have absolutely zero knowledge of ship navigation, ship handling, how to handle yourself aboard a ship or anything else, but as long as you had a friend who was a captain, you could get yourself a reasonably decently paid position aboard a warship, and the captain might have said, yeah, come along with me, we'll be great friends. Like, your only qualification might be you're his drinking buddy. I'm the captain, I'll deal with all the shenanigans that are going on around us. You just have to sit back, relax, and do what I say. That might sound great, except for the fact that, firstly, you stick people like that aboard a ship for a particularly long period of time. Sooner or later, they are going to figure out they are second in power only to the captain, and abuse of power may or may not begin, and or something might happen to the captain, like, he might have to go to sleep, amongst other things. At which point you are now the senior most officer on the ship, and you're in a position of, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm in charge of this vessel. Now, if you're a very, very smart and lucky person in that position, then you might turn around to the master of the ship and say, well, what do you think we should do? And then quietly go, okay, yep, that's a good idea. That's exactly what I was thinking as well. Let's do that. If you're unlucky and see the aforementioned power trippers, or arrogant, then you might decide, I know what I'm doing, it can't possibly be that difficult, and what do you mean, Sandbank? Oh, great. And the Royal Navy was not particularly keen on this happening repeatedly. So now there was an examination, and if you couldn't demonstrate a minimum possible level of competency, then you couldn't become a lieutenant, which in theory would improve the quality of the officer corps in the Royal Navy. Now, of course, as time went on, people developed ways of bypassing the lieutenant's exam by, having friends on the examination board or bribing people and so on and so forth. But it did at least reduce the number of incompetent officers coming up the track, the command track, even if it didn't eliminate the problem entirely. The flip side to it, of course, was that if the examination board was made up of a bunch of senior officers who might all be some various form of gentry or aristocracy, you might be the single most competent lieutenant out there, but if you've been born as the son of a butcher, they might not just want you in their old boys club and still deny you a promotion you actually deserved, which is the other side of things. So yeah, not a perfect solution, but better than what was in place before. Sworn brother of the Ballistic Order of St. John Moses Browning asks, since roughly the 18th century, square-rigged sailing ships have usually had a large gaff-rigged sail on the mizzenmast, but on similar ships built roughly before 1700 or so, square-rigged ships seem to have had a lateen-rigged sail on the mizzenmast instead. Why did the lateen sail on the mizzenmast go out of style, and does the gaff-rigged sail have any particular advantage? So for those of you wondering what on earth these types of sails are, admittedly this is all in French, but a lateen-rigged sail looks something like examples C and D here. So you have a single diagonal yard, and this is obviously rigged fore and aft, from which a sail hangs. A gaff rig, on the other hand, is like the sail indicated here by type E. So whereas the other two are triangular, this one is a quadrilateral, and it has a yard both at the top and the bottom. Now, obviously there are subtle variations to this. A gaff rig sail doesn't just have to come off of the mizzenmast, it can come past the mizzenmast as well, but you get the general idea. Now, both of these types are on the mizzenmast to help ships sail towards or into the wind, because square-rigged sails, which is type B on here, they're brilliant at running with the wind or just off of the wind, but if you want to turn around and head in the direction of the wind or in that entire half of the arc, it's, not a particularly good idea. However, the lateen rig, which was adopted mostly out of the Mediterranean, it's very good for generating speed. It's pretty good for manoeuvring to windward, but it has a few disadvantages as well. It's a little bit harder to tack with because it's only supported by this single main yard. It can be quite a bit to handle in significant winds, and because of its triangular shape, in order to get a decent sail area out of it, it has to be quite large in terms of length, which means it tends to have to be mounted relatively high on a mast, and therefore it can be a bit of a difficult thing to handle, can cause stability issues and so forth at larger sizes. And as time went on, warships were getting larger and larger. It's also because, again, it's all dependent on this one yard, it's also much easier to lose the thing to dismasting, and it's a bigger target to start with. Whereas the gaff rig, because of it having 4 sides rather than just 3, for a proportional height, it actually has more surface area, which means if you want the same kind of surface area to generate manoeuvring capability, you can have it mounted lower, and that means your ship is more stable, it's a smaller target, you're less likely to be dismasted by enemy action or the weather. It's also a little bit more controllable because you have 2 yards to play with, and of course if you do have it mounted higher, as you would with a lateen style sail, then you have a greater surface area, which means more propulsive and manoeuvring capability. Now, of course, because you have 2 yards and all the associated gear and tackle with it, you also have to deal with the fact it is a little bit more complex, and the materials that go with the sail are a bit heavier to deal with, but, as I say, a little bit more durable and a bit more predictable. And because you have 2 points of control, 2 solid points of control, it's also a little bit easier to maneuver with. So basically, for a large warship as of the sizes that you're getting in the 18th century, it makes a lot more sense than a lateen rig. They're both you need one or the other to allow yourself to maneuver forward, and in some parts of the ship a lateen rig sail might be the only thing you can realistically fit. But when you're talking about mizzenmast fittings, a gaff rig sail makes more sense once the innovation is brought in for general purposes of warships. Worth Wayne Packer asks, was there ever a time during the Guadalcanal campaign that US carrier air power was reduced enough for Japan to send the Yamatos to bombard Henderson Field with reasonable expectation of escaping without incurring severe air attack? So if we ignore obviously the other reasons why the Japanese didn't send the Yamatos in, fuel, economy, prestige, etc., etc., let's say they were willing, but they, like you suggest, they wanted to wait until they were sure, or relatively sure, that carrier air power wouldn't be a significant problem. Now, of course, Henderson Field's aircraft might be a problem, but as with the Congo's bombardment of Henderson Field, you could run in at night and hit Henderson Field and then hopefully disable it well enough that Henderson Field couldn't then respond the following day, which is kind of the entire plan, I suppose. And the Yamatos do have the turn of speed to be able to do that if necessary. Now, if you want to identify a period where US carrier air power just wasn't there, flat out there is no risk of being attacked by a US fleet carrier, there is actually such a time period during the Guadalcanal campaign. The first 2 weeks of November 1942. Because if you look through the American carrier fleet that was available at the start of World War II, well, at least the start of the American involvement in World War II, bear in mind, this is still 1942, so USS Essex is not in theatre yet. So, going in approximate order of construction, Lexington has been lost at Coral Sea. Saratoga was torpedoed at the end of August and is still undergoing repairs. Ranger is over in the Atlantic. Yorktown has been sunk at Midway. Enterprise has just been damaged at the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands at the end of October. She'll be back in mid-November, but at the moment she's undergoing repairs and she won't be back up to full spec anyway. Hornet has obviously just been lost at the Battle of Santa Cruz. And Wasp has been torpedoed and sunk. So that's the entirety of the American pre-war fleet carrier program. So Essex and her sisters and the Independences are all on their way, but nothing is available right this instant. So at that point in time, the first 2 weeks of November, there is no American carrier available which can oppose a Yamato run. The following few weeks after that, the second half of November, Enterprise would be around, but it would only be a partial load because Enterprise is damaged, not fully capable. And then towards the end of the year, Saratoga comes back online, relieves Enterprise, and of course USS Robin, aka HMS Victoria, shows up, and then it becomes progressively harder and harder. But there is a theoretical window, as I said, at the beginning of November where you could send Yamato and or Musashi in if you have them available and bombard Henderson Field, and assuming that you knock out Henderson Field, there's nothing that anyone can do to stop you air power-wise apart from some level bombing B-17 strikes. Neil asks, apart from the obvious sources like aviation fuel, oil or munitions stored outside the magazines, are there any other items or components of 20th century warships, specifically on battleships and battlecruisers, that can cause fires after damage was sustained? Yes, there are a few, although it does depend on exactly what ship you're looking at, what time period. So paint comes in two stages. One, if you have an awful lot of paint on your ship, i.e. multiple layers, then that can, depending on the formulation, be a fairly significant fire hazard. Then the other type of paint is the paint that's still in cans. That in and of itself turns out to be actually remarkably flammable, to the extent that, as I mentioned in a few other dry docks, on a number of damage control diagrams on American battleships that are still preserved as museum ships, when you go and see them, you'll notice that pretty much the only thing marked there in red as a major fire hazard that's not an ammunition locker or a fuel tanker or a magazine of some description is the paint store. So, hit to the paint store could actually cause quite a worrying fire. And if you've got like 2 inches of paint on all the surfaces and a fire starts, that's going to be fairly bad news as well. There are a couple of other possible sources. If you're in the earlier part of the 1900 to 1950 period, i.e. probably realistically the first couple of decades, then coal dust can be a significant problem, both in terms of coal dust that might be aerosolized by impacts and explosions and that create a fuel air bomb effect, or coal dust that has built up on the walls, the ceilings, and impregnate itself in the deck, etc. Because that stuff will burn really, really nicely, which is not a good thing. Then, of course, you've got anything that's wooden and not heavily treated. So, technically the deck can catch fire, but it's actually quite difficult to get the deck to catch fire. It takes a while. But ship's boats, usually flammable. Wooden furniture, usually flammable. Things like the men's hammocks and kit, flammable once they get going. And it depends also how intense the fire is. At lower temperatures, it's not so much of a hazard, but as if the temperature goes up, as maybe a fire gets hold and starts to spread, then things like rubber seals on bulkhead doors can get quite flammable. Even the rubber that is attached to electrical wires for insulation purposes can start to burn, or at least release a lot of toxic fumes. And of course, in later warships, although mostly outside of the scope of the channel, you have either, well, not aluminium, but aluminium magnesium alloys, which were sometimes used. Aluminium just tends to melt in intense heat. It's a bit more difficult to get aluminium to catch fire, but it shouldn't really take much explanation as to why alloying something with magnesium, whilst it does make for a rather spectacularly light material, can also cause some issues when there's a very intense fire going. Now, to be fair, even an aluminium magnesium alloy panel in and of itself is extremely unlikely to actually catch fire and burn. You could stand on the other side of it and you'd be reasonably safe. But the problem is that the damage that tends to result in massive fires also tends to blow things into tiny pieces, and very small fragments or powdered, shattered aluminium magnesium alloy will burn. It's basically a matter of surface area. Same way as you can get flour and chocolate powder to explode if you aerosolize it and introduce sparks. So, yeah, if you blow a hole in the side of the superstructure or something made of an aluminium magnesium alloy, there's a reasonable chance that some of the debris that's been created will catch fire, which, again, unhelpful. Brian Smith asks, the Royal Navy had the Queen Anne's Mansion-style superstructure, and the Japanese had the Pagoda for some of their ships. Were there other navies that had names given to their superstructure, such as US Navy fast battleships, since they all look a bit similar? I'm not aware of any nicknames for superstructures for other nations' navies that have reached quite the same extent of use as the nickname Queen Anne Mansion and Pagoda for the Royal and Japanese navies. There are some others in use, though. So, for example, you look at Italian World War II ships, and they're quite often described as having wedding cake superstructures because of the rather large cylindrical nature of their range-finding and fire control platforms, and the fact they tended to stack them, hence wedding cake. For the US Navy's fast battleships, as exemplified by USS New Jersey here, yes, there is a very distinctive nature to that superstructure tower there. I've seen it referred to in various ways as some form of pyramid or triangular structure, which it technically is. I mean, it's not, Great Pyramid of Giza style, but there is a certain pyramidal nature to it, at least in terms of the fact it's a vaguely sort of cone shape, wider at the base and the sides, narrowing gradually towards the top. And that is, if you ever have the good fortune to be able to climb inside one, very, very obvious, because you have the central armoured column that contains the fire control cables running for the rangefinders and later radars stuck on top, running down through the centre. And then as you go up right towards the base, there might be multiple rooms, but the further and further you go up, it very rapidly becomes 4 distinct compartments linked by hatches, and every time you go up a level, you notice those 4 compartments are getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until you reach the base of the fire control director, at which point you then go into a single compartment right up top. I'm personally not aware of the German superstructure style, although again, across the Hippers and Bismarcks, etc., it is reasonably common-ish in appearance. But I'm personally not aware of any nickname for that's gained any particularly wide prevalence or acceptance. But if someone else knows one, let us know in the comments. The Deutschlands basically have 3 ships with 3 completely different superstructure design styles, so I wouldn't really go looking for them for consistency. The French, again, Dunkirk, Richelieu, etc., there is a certain common theme emerging with their superstructure styles, but once again, I'm not aware of it gaining any particular nickname. Mark Griffiths asks, can you give a brief overview of Victoria Drummond MBE and her career? From what I've heard or read, I believe it's deserving of wider awareness. So yes, brief overview, definitely someone worth reading up more on. There's a full biography of her that was actually written in the 90s, but a brief summary, she's born at the end of the 19th century to what you would, at least in Britain, term as lower upper class, a lower upper class family. So they had connections, so upper class would be things like, Duke of Norfolk or the royal family. Middle upper class would be lesser nobility, but still with a long pedigree behind them. And then the lower upper class would be sort of more recent nobility and so forth. But anyway, she was theoretically relatively well connected in society. Her father worked for the royal family and the monarch directly. And in theory, therefore, she could have entered upper-class society relatively easily, but actually instead chose to become a ship's engineer instead, a marine engineer, which is a little bit of a rather sharp career change compared to what obviously most people would expect her to do in the 1900s and 1910s. And so she served out her apprenticeships ashore, learning the trade, and then went out to sea for the first time in the late 1910s as an engineer aboard a ship. Now, obviously, as you might expect, there was a certain amount of resistance, given that we're talking about the very early 20th century, to a woman doing what had been literally up until that point an exclusively male job, at least as far as anyone could tell, at least. But at the same time, it was actually significantly less resistance than you might expect given pop culture, etc., about what those times were like. By her own account, by and large, her fellow engineers and other stokers and so forth who worked down in the engine room were pretty much accepting of her, especially once she proved her credentials, because she was actually a pretty darn good marine engineer. There would, however, on a semi-regular basis, be one or two people in the engine room who didn't accept her for, well, the most obvious reasons, and the occasional issue from passengers and so forth. But the interesting thing is that actually opposition to her being there on the grounds that she was a female engineer was remarkably thin on the ground. Usually you're limited to one or two people on any given voyage. And as I say, this is by her own account. And so she progressed her way up through the ranks, getting more experience, serving on a variety of ships. The only real main complication where you would have the expected kind of pop culture levels of resistance to her capabilities, simply from the fact that she was a woman, actually came from the higher echelons of things, more specifically the Board of Trade, because you have to sit various exams to ascend through your qualifications as an engineer. And when she wanted to be a chief engineer, the Board of Trade just basically flat out refused to give her those qualifications on the grounds that she was a woman, but to try and disguise that, every time she sat the examination, rather than just fail her automatically, they failed the entire class, which isn't exactly any better. But it does show, I think, something of the difference between, if you like, the establishment, who are very set in their ways and are just like, oh yes, I can't possibly have a woman doing a man job, and the rank and file people who are actually out there doing the job, who for the most part really couldn't care less what gender you were, as long as you got the job done properly, which she did in a fairly spectacular style. She served throughout World War II. Her sort of a claim to fame during that period was that when one of the ships she was on came under attack by German bombers, she managed not only to get the ship up to about a third faster than it had ever gone before to help it dodge and weave, but also as the ship took damage from near misses and she was injured, she managed to get other members of the engineering crew out of the engine room, but stayed at her post in order to first get the ship speed up and then keep the ship's speed up, obviously, which would have been a fairly dangerous thing, but thanks to her efforts, the ship survived and she would continue on. And she would eventually become a chief engineer, no thanks to the Board of Trade. From my skim reading of her biography, it's not entirely clear how she got that qualification. She did qualify as a chief engineer in a couple of other countries, so she had the qualifications if the shipping line in question was willing to accept those. But I couldn't quite figure out if the Board of Trade ever relented from their rather stupid position and actually let her sit an exam fairly. If they didn't, well, then whichever the successor organisation is to the Board of Trade really needs to give her a retroactive honorary promotion, but, that's probably something for more detailed research to find out. But yeah, definitely a lady whose story needs more recognition. Saul Ginsler asks, were variable pitch propellers tried on naval ships during the time period that the channel covers, and what are the major advantages and disadvantages of this propeller type over a more conventional model? Yep, as I indicated actually in an earlier question, variable pitch propellers were around pretty much from almost the start of the time that propellers themselves were around on ships. Initially, the idea was fairly simple, to try and feather the propeller, i.e. to minimise the drag that it created when a ship wasn't using it. Bear in mind the early ships would only use their propellers some of the time, and that would obviate the need to hoist the propeller out of the water, which was another solution, or to just endure the fact that you're going to have drag while you're under sail. Now, as time went on, obviously people realised the utility of using propellers that had a variable pitch to ensure better performance of ships while they were at sea, because obviously if you change the pitch you can get a much coarser setting for slow speed work, and then as you get faster and faster you can make the setting finer and finer to improve or maintain your efficiency as the speed regimen changes. However, they weren't in use over the conventional fixed propeller all that much on naval ships at the time. So whilst you will find variable pitch propellers on some smaller craft, particularly coastal craft and amphibious landing craft, the main three reasons why you don't see them on major warships is, first of all, a variable pitch propeller is a jack of all trades, master of none. So it's not going to be as efficient at any particular regimen as compared to a fixed pitch propeller at that particular regimen that's designed for it. Secondly, the maintenance costs of a variable pitch propeller are much higher. Obviously, there's a lot more that can go wrong in something that has significant moving parts as opposed to a static pitch propeller. And so, over the long term, not only the need to actually maintain it, but the cost of doing that maintenance puts navies off, because you don't want to have to be fixing your means of propulsion halfway through the ocean because, a motor's burnt out or a lock has broken and now suddenly one of your propeller blades is just wobbling around in the current. And finally, related to that, variable pitch propellers are considerably more vulnerable to damage than a conventional fixed propeller. Conventional fixed propeller, just big lump of shaped bronze. You basically have to break the thing physically or possibly bend it to get it to stop working in any way, shape or form. Whereas if you deliver shock damage, let's say from near misses from bombs and shells, to a fixed pitch propeller, that will just be like, it's Tuesday. Whereas for a variable pitch propeller, that could cause things to break, which best case scenario breaks things in such a way that the propeller is stuck fixed at the pitch that it was at the time. Worst case scenario, things break completely and you now have no control over the pitch and it just wildly fluctuates, and then you're really in trouble at that point. Texas and LaShock asks, years ago I saw the North American PBJ Mitchell Devil Dog at the commemorative Air Force Air Show on static display. The ground crew pointed out the array of cannons mounted in the nose and declared that they could cut a destroyer in half. While it sounded impressive at the time, I think I was 12 or 13 back then, as I got older I became more sceptical. So are there any instances of a PBJ cutting a destroyer in two? And if not, how do you think they would fare against them? So the B-25 Mitchell did have a fair number of kills against enemy coastal craft, escort boats, patrol boats, and destroyers. Now, as far as cutting a destroyer in half purely with its guns, not really gonna happen. Some models had a 3-inch gun plus some 50 cals. Others just had loads and loads and loads of 50 cals. Now, on the one hand, Japanese destroyers tended to be built fairly lightly to the point that 50 cal machine gun fire was actually a legitimate threat. It could punch through their hull plate. So, in theory, given that some of them could point up to 14 50 cals forward, if you let loose with enough ammo and gradually sawed your way up a ship, you probably could eventually saw one in half. But in your average strafing run, in and of itself, it's not going to happen. But of course, B-25s could also carry skip bombs, they could carry rockets and so forth, which they would obviously also use in the attack. So a B-25 attack breaking a destroyer in half is entirely possible. And if it got a decent strafing run in, and maybe the destroyer was caught unawares or whatever, or just very bad at anti-aircraft gunnery, if it came in low and slow, perpendicular to the destroyer, I can see the B-25, if it's one of the ones that can fire 14 50 cals forward, I can see it putting enough rounds if it put them in, let's say amidships of a Japanese destroyer to compromise enough of the lightly built structure of the ship such that either a violent maneuver or a near miss from something that the bomber carries that's a bit more explosive, or maybe even just the ship's momentum, might then cause a structural failure of the destroyer, or at least a structural failure of some of the hull plates that have been completely riddled, which could then result in the ship rolling over and sinking or whatever, and the overall stresses of all of that might well cause the ship to break apart in roughly the area where it was hit. But to do that with just the guns alone would be a bit of a rare event. So I'm not aware personally of any B-25s physically cutting a destroyer in half with their gunfire. I can easily believe they did it to some of the smaller ships that they targeted. But for a full-sized fleet destroyer, I can see the effects of a particularly concentrated strafing run causing a ship to break apart in that area as it eventually founders. But not directly just sawing something in half with 50 cal fire, as wonderful an image as that might be. At least for people who like aircraft over ships. Chris. Nicholas Rassar asks, what would have been acceptable losses at Jutland for the British whilst destroying the German fleet? Could they have traded kills on a one-for-one basis and still have been okay? Well, trading one-for-one would be a fairly significant problem for the British, because given the amount they outnumbered the Germans by, that would indicate that overall the Germans performed far, far better than they did, which would be a fairly significant problem going forward. So acceptable losses for the British in exchange for the entirety of the High Seas Fleet, I think they would have at least have looked for a 3-to-2 kill ratio or a 1.5-to-1 kill ratio. That probably would have been the upper limit of what everyone would have thought to be a fair exchange rate. If you're talking about the entirety of the Dreadnought and battlecruiser fleet. We ignore the pre-Dreadnoughts for the moment. Let's assume that, I don't know, light forces are on a cruisers and mulch them or whatever, because things get a bit more difficult at that point. So, yeah, I mean, if the British had come back saying, okay, well, you know, we've sunk the entirety of the High Seas Fleet's modern capital ship forces and we've lost 3 battle cruisers and say 8 or 9 battleships to destroy the entire high seas fleet, so 5 battlecruisers and 16 dreadnoughts, it would still be on the high end for losses, but people could probably accept that and walk away with it. I think, yeah. So that would probably be pushing the upper end of what would be considered losses, given that would be fair given the proportional nature of the battle, at least in the eyes of people evaluating the battle afterwards. However, if, for sake of argument, they had traded kills 1 for 1, let's have a quick look at what that would mean. So that would mean that there were a total of 4 battlecruisers left after the battle, albeit that there would be another battlecruiser, so a 5th battlecruiser available shortly thereafter, because HMS Australia wasn't present. So, you'd have 5 battlecruisers left, which would that would then leave you with 100% of all operational battlecruisers on the planet, because admittedly Hindenburg is still under construction, but at the time, then the British would be the only ones with battlecruisers, and then Hindenburg would be outnumbered 5 to 1. Although, it depends on who is lost. So Queen Mary, as we know, was lost on the British side. Now, if you could somehow contrive to lose... Well, you're not going to lose New Zealand because plot shields, but if assuming you contrive to lose Queen Mary, the 3 Invincibles, and Indefatigable was lost anyway, thus leaving you with New Zealand, Tiger, Princess Royal and Lion, that would be a much different scenario to, say, losing Princess Royal, Tiger, and obviously already lost Queen Mary, and losing Lion as well, and then being left with New Zealand and the 3 Invincibles. So, well, you'd be left with a Splendid Cat at that point if you're going to have... No, that's 4. Yeah, so if you're left with 4 I-types and you've lost all your modern ones, that's a very different scenario to being left with all your modern ones plus New Zealand, minus Queen Mary. And to a certain extent, the same also applies to the battleships. So you've got... If you're exchanging at the time, so you've got 28 versus 16, so that would leave you, the Royal Navy, with 12 dreadnoughts left on the field. But in addition to that, you also have Queen Elizabeth herself, who's in Drydock, Emperor of India, 3 Revenge class that are coming online, and Dreadnought herself. So that would leave you with 5 more battleships to come in. So that would put your total battleship force up from 12 up to 17, which would mean that the Royal Navy's dreadnought force would now be fractionally larger than the German Navy's entire dreadnought force had been going into the battle. Germany brings in Bayern and Baden. They're now outnumbered 17 to 2, so that gives them a significant advantage over the Germans. But again, which ships are lost? Because the best case scenario for the Royal Navy, if we're looking to knock off 16 vessels, I mean, flipping out, that's a lot of people, but if you're going to go for it, then you could probably afford... Well, if you afford to lose Agincourt, Neptune, the 2 Colossus class, so that's 4, the 3 St. Vincent's and 3 Bellerophons adds up to 6, so that's a total of 10. Now you need to find another 6 to lose, because that's all of your 12-inch gunships that are present. The Dreadnought is obviously not present. So then you start looking into what other ships you can afford to lose. So Erin and Canada, they're powerful, but they're one-offs, so you could probably afford... Well, you don't want to lose them, but they would be next on the list, I guess. You'd have a fairly hefty bill for Chile afterwards if Canada was lost, but still, that's 12. And then the Orions are the next ones. They're the earliest super dreadnoughts. So losing the 4 Orions as well takes you up to 16. That leaves you with your initial surviving fleet of the 4 QEs, the 2 Revenges, the 3 King George V's and the 3 Iron Dukes that are present, and then, as I said, the others come in. So that's the absolute ideal state if you're trading 1-for-1 at Jutland for the Royal Navy, and that leaves you with only your more modern 13.5-inch ships and your 15-inch ships. So, I mean, it's an awful, awful time for the Royal Navy, but they have a modern core. Of course, it's incredibly unlikely in a scenario where you're trading 1-for-1 that you're going to get everything that neatly. And the more and more it eats into your modern 13.5-inch ships and your 15-inch ships as well, the less and less good, if you can describe the situation as good at all, that it gets. Now, the interesting thing is that actually even such disastrous losses would still leave the Royal Navy as the top dreadnought battleship power, believe it or not, because the next closest navy in terms of total numbers of dreadnought battleships is, by this point, the US Navy. But when you look through their list of dreadnought battleships that will be available by, let's say, the end of 1916, because survivors in a battle like that are going to need to be patched up. So you've got 2 South Carolinas, 2 Delawares, 2 Floridas, 2 Wyomings, so that's all your 12-inch ships for a total of 8. And then you've got the 2 New Yorks, so that's 10. Then the 2 Nevadas, it's 12. Both of the Nevadas being commissioned in 1916. And then, technically speaking, Pennsylvania and Arizona also commissioning in 1916. So that's going to take you up to 14. And then the New Mexicos aren't coming in until 17, 18, 19. So by the end of the year, even with Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada and Oklahoma all coming into service that year, the Royal Navy would have a small but still present 3-ship advantage over the United States. Obviously, then that exactly which ships have actually survived will influence that. But of course, you've got Queen Elizabeth. Even if you somehow contrive to lose all Queen Elizabeth and Revenge class that were present at the battle, you still at least have the other 3 plus QE herself. So a 4-ship 15-inch 15-inch battle line, which I guess kind of matches up against the 4 standards that are coming in by the end of 1916, and then older ships to match up against the New York class and down. Still not a great situation. In those circumstances, then you're going to see a lot of ships having to be, regardless of which ships have been lost, you're going to see a lot of ships having to be built. Now, you're not going to see Renown and Repulse come in as battleships because they've already basically been they've been laid down, they're under construction by the time of Jutland. You're not getting them back. Resistance, the last one, has been, again, likewise cancelled for probably a bit too long. But Hood's sisters are not going to be cancelled. In fact, work on Hood and her sisters is going to be massively accelerated to try and bring the Royal Navy's fleet strength up. And you're probably going to see some kind of 8-gun 15-inch ship, whether that be a QE successor or a Revenge successor, suddenly being crash built, probably in extremely large numbers, probably, an 8-ship class similar to the plans for the Revenge class, in order to make up the numbers. So between them and the Admiral class, that's 12 ships to replace the lost 16, and then more to compensate further. If you've somehow got the magical scenario where it's almost entirely the 12 and the early 13.5-inch ships that have been lost, they'll probably do that as an emergency war build and then take a step back and think, what do we want our next generation to be? If you've lost a lot of the higher end ships, i.e. the Iron Dukes, King George V's, Revenges, QEs, etc., then they're probably just going to keep piling through these emergency QE-Revenge successor designs. So Could they have traded kills 1-for-1 and still been the leading navy? Yes, just about, but flipping heck, you will not want to see the interior of the Admiralty when that panic discussion happens. The Rogue Chief asks, for Royal Navy scientific expeditions, how did officers and men normally view such assignments, and how were officer assignments to such missions usually determined? They appear to have been viewed with a fair degree of prestige. Certainly for things like Cook's expeditions and Franklin's expeditions, there was no need to go out searching for crew. Obviously, especially at Cook's period, but also to a certain degree in the latter period, the custom of manning a ship by posting notices asking for volunteers was kind of par for the course, and it's certainly in Cook's voyage's case, there wasn't a shortage of volunteers. In fact, they had so many volunteers that the Admiralty was able to instruct certain minimum standards in terms of competence in sailing and health and so forth, which they volunteers had to clear in order for them to be accepted on the voyage. So, and a lot of it's because it was going to be a relatively peaceful voyage, so easy money. And in terms of the money itself, quite often the scientific voyages were sponsored not just by the Navy, you got your Navy pay, but they'd also be sponsored by various societies and newspapers, so there was a bit of extra money in it that way. Because most of these scientific ships either carried a minimal to no armament, depending on the time period. Obviously, Endeavour and Discovery would carry guns, Erebus and Terror not really so much. Therefore, there was less of the more back-breaking versions of physical labour and more space to be in. So, it was relatively speaking cushy accommodations. They were usually scientific expeditions were known to be very well supplied, so better food, etc. And also, a fair number of scientific expeditions tended to be heading over looking for prizes, not the main goal thereof, but for example, with the Northwest Passage, the Franklin expedition, there was a prize for the first ship or ships to clear the Northwest Passage, which would be shared amongst the crew. So there were a fair degree of incentives for people to volunteer. In terms of the officers, for the most part, again, it would be volunteer officers, although there would be a core crew. So obviously the expedition leader would be chosen either by the Admiralty, the people sponsoring the expedition, or both. But there would be a core crew of the ship itself, which the Admiralty would assign to look after that in terms of the officers. But beyond that, and obviously the officers could theoretically, if they wanted to, request a transfer, but to fill out the ranks of the officers, midshipmen, etc., again, it would be a case of, people expressing a willingness to serve aboard, which, again, they generally did. Send Penguins asks, can you think of any other wacky and wonderful conversions of ships into bizarre roles like USS Sable and Wolverine? I know training carriers aren't wacky, but coal-fired paddle-wheel-driven carriers without any hangar space gets a lot closer to what I consider wacky. Or things like USS Crane Ship No. 2. Well, there's a whole bunch of things, like this photo, which I've pointed out before. So, it kind of looks like a pair of battleships and a carrier anchor. Nope. Those are, in fact, 2 merchant ships. Well, 3 merchant ships, actually, at anchor, converted to look like 2 battleships and a carrier. Now, obviously, they don't actually serve as battleships. They're not going to be going off and shooting people. But they prove immensely useful at distracting and confusing the Germans as to where exactly the Royal Navy's battleships are. Because this is at very close range. You see that photos from this taken from above at 15,000 to 20,000 feet. You're going to believe that those are real capital ships. So that's something of a weird and wacky conversion for you. Another ship, which I've mentioned in previous dry docks, which I do need to cover at some point, the wonderful paddle wheel anti-aircraft ship. There are actually quite a number of them, but used in various harbours in the UK. It looks literally like an antiquated 1890s era vessel, something that's a bit more steampunk than real world, but then now dressed up in camouflage colours and covered in anti-aircraft guns. And then you've got things like the what I call the Matryoshka doll submarine. Now, I believe that's the Italian submarine Leonardo da Vinci. So it's a submarine that was then converted to carry other smaller submarines on its back to go over to the United States to attack merchant ships in harbour. Now, you might think, okay, so far so Italian with the special operations they did. However, of course, there's an added layer of complexity, because once those mini-subs got into harbour, they in turn had to deploy frogmen. So it was a submarine which deployed a smaller submarine, which deployed divers, which would then end up attaching the explosive charges, who would then have to re-enter the mini-subs, which would in theory have to then go back out to find the Leonardo da Vinci, in theory redocking with it, although in practice probably just finding the sub and then scuttling themselves, and then the submarine could go back home. As it turned out, the sub was sunk before the operation could take place, but yeah, it's quite a funny conversion to me. And whilst technically still serving in roughly the role she was built in, the Russian salvage vessel, now called Kommuna, would probably also qualify, in as much as between her time of construction and the present, she's served as a submarine tender, a submarine rescue ship, a mini-submarine carrier, and more recently as a general salvage vessel for both submarines and other things that have ended up at the bottom of the ocean, like aircraft and surface vessels. And yeah, so, and to be fair, I think technically she fulfills the modified or converted requirement, because she has been refitted and switched around a fair bit. But also, you know, she's this weird but entirely functional cross between something that looks like a turn of the 20th century freighter, a catamaran, and a stolen half of St Pancras Station. But, you know, 110 years in active service, going pretty well. Andrew Waite asks, the incompatibility between British 15-inch shells and the 15-inch guns of the Richelieus was in hindsight a somewhat unfortunate oversight. To what extent did the British and French collaborate on warship and naval weapons development in the first half of the 20th century? Well, the 15-inch shell mismatch comes from the fact that, technically speaking, a lot of what we would call 15-inch guns aren't. The same thing with 6-inch guns and so forth. Basically because everybody, especially in the treaty period, tried to get as close to their opponent's weapons, but sometimes they used different forms of measurement. So the Japanese usually used metric, and so did the French. So the French guns are actually 380mm guns, which is technically speaking 14.96 and a bit inches, whereas the British were just using flat-out imperial measurements, so 15-inch guns, which translates over to metric is 381mm and plus or minus a little bit as well. So they are actually fractionally different sizes, and the same thing all the way on down. Now, in terms of overall British and French collaboration on warship and naval weapons development in the first half of the 20th century, basically none. They might have been allies in World War I, and they might have been allies in World War II for the first bit, and the Free French obviously then stuck with that as well. But Britain was still, for the majority of that time, considering itself to be either the top or one of the two top naval powers. France was a rival, especially early on, and they all were being very secretive about how they built their ships, and they had different interests and tastes in how they built their ships as well. So, yeah, there really was not any particular collaboration. The French had worked with their own guns. They'd built and developed their own guns. The British did the same. So, you know, the French had 13.4-inch guns. The British had 13.5-inch guns. They both had 12-inch guns, but of different styles. The French were ahead in electricity. The British were ahead in turbines. The British started off the dreadnought race. The French were one of the last to get there. And so on and so on and so forth. Obviously, the French started off being the first ones to build quadruple-turreted ships, or design them at least, with the Normandies. And also then once the Dunkirks and Strasbourgs were laid down to actually bring them into service, the British bringing the King George V in with quads had nothing to do design-wise with the French. The same way with the American quad designs for the North Carolinas. The British, however, did bring forward, obviously, the all-forward armament with a Nelson. The Dunkirks and Richelieus took the idea, but they did it slightly differently. Again, no particular collaboration involved. Most of the gun calibers at the smaller sizes, except where the treaty enforced them to be similar, were usually quite different. Armour manufacturers were different. Armour makeups were different. Power plants used were different. Yeah, it was basically no real collaboration. And to be honest, unless you were a paying customer, like with Russia buying Tashkent or the Greeks buying Salamis, etc., no country really would collaborate with another country in warship and naval weapons development in that time period. It was either a case of you contract with an individual yard to build you an individual ship, and that might happen to be a yard in another country, but you're not sharing state-level secrets with each other. Andrew Waite asks, having rewatched your video on the loss of HMS Hood, the fatal 15-inch shell hit on Hood's hull below the armoured belt seems similar to the second shell from Prince of Wales to hit Bismarck, also below the armoured belt. This shell exploded on contact with the torpedo bulkhead, ultimately leading to the abandonment of No. 2 boiler room. Did the design of Bismarck have vulnerable areas where such a penetrating hit below the armoured belt could have caused Bismarck, like Hood, to explode? Not particularly, no. Certainly if you take it as read that in order to cause Bismarck to explode, you need to set off the magazines. The big vulnerability that Hood has, as compared to later ships, is as a World War I designed ship, her armour belt does not go that far below the waterline, even in a relatively heavily loaded state, as compared to Bismarck, Prince of Wales, Iowa, whatever. Now, whilst Bismarck's main belt doesn't go as far below the waterline as something like a King George V's belt does, it still goes down below the waterline a fair amount. And the other thing is, because she has the turtleback armour scheme, the magazine where the charges are kept is actually above the deck of the magazine is approximately speaking at the same level as the lower level of the belt armour. There's the shell room below, but the shells are much less vulnerable to being set off. Now, therefore, if a shell comes in, for it to come in at an angle such that it could get underneath the armour belt, get through the torpedo protection, through the oil tanks, through a 1.5-inch bulkhead, and then detonate either in the vicinity of a magazine, perhaps enough to send hot splinters into the magazine and cause a boom, it would have to come in at a very, very shallow angle. And if it's coming in at a very shallow angle, then it's going to hit the water well away from Bismarck, and regardless of any significant sea state conditions, it's incredibly unlikely that the shell is going to be able to travel through that much water, even if it's a reduced amount of water, in order to get deep enough to bypass the belt protection. Now, in theory, such a shot could come in when Bismarck was damaged in her last battle, and leading into her last battle as well. There was a list, which obviously during the battle got worse. Now, obviously, that would mean on the side that she was on the side away from what she was listing to, i.e. let's say, for sake of argument, if she's listing to port, her starboard side is going to be raised up, and that would then expose more of the underwater portion of the hull, or at least bring it closer to the surface, at which point an incoming shell might have a direct path either to or near the magazines. But the amount of list that would entail would in and of itself be fairly dangerous, but also, of course, that's the list on the other side. So if you're battering away at the ship to the point you flooded enough that she is listing, you're on that side. The exposed bit, which is more vulnerable, is on the other side. So you'd have to have, 2 battleships come in, one from each side, in order to do that. But that's not really a design weakness, vulnerable area per se, because any ship that's badly hit and listing would have that same vulnerability. Potentially, you could argue in the case of the modern 1930s battleships, maybe Bismarck might have a little bit more vulnerability to that than most others, because her belt doesn't extend quite as far below the waterline as some other ships do, but it's still a lot better than something like Hood's for that kind of, for the depth involved. So yeah, obviously you do have shell hits to the extremities, but we're considering the citadel here, you know, where the area that could potentially go big boom is located. Now, there is only one kind of, not necessarily one in a million, but very, very, very highly improbable, but possible scenario where that kind of hit could come in. And that's because, if you remember from previous discussions, Bismarck's a very stable ship, a fairly wide beam ship. But that means that in high sea states, when things get very rough and she does start to roll, that rolling movement is going to be very sharp and very violent, and potentially quite considerable. Now, in those circumstances, because of the way that she moves, it's possible that in those particular weather conditions, she might have a large enough and violent enough roll motion, again, to create a very, very brief moment of weakness. But that's not necessarily an inherent flaw. Well, it's not an inherent flaw with the armor protection system. It might be a very, very small inherent flaw with the overall design, as opposed to a ship that rolls a little bit more often, but perhaps more gently. But it's such a vanishingly rare occurrence, considering you can't usually plan what weather you're going to fight somebody in, that I'd basically write it off as near enough negligible. Snowstalker 36 asks, have any other ships had as extensive a refit history as the Kitakami? Admittedly, Kitakami did have a fair old bit of a change around, going from a regular light cruiser to a torpedo cruiser to a transport to a Kai-10 carrier, with a various few intermediate steps in between. Whilst it might not be as radical in a step as Kitakami's various changes, HMS Furious is probably in the running. You know, starting off designed as a large light cruiser, quote unquote, or small battle cruiser with a pair of 18-inch guns, then actually being completed with just an aft-mounted 18-inch gun and a forward-flying off-deck, then having that aft gun removed and a rear landing deck installed, but with the superstructure in the middle, then having the superstructure removed and being converted again into a flush-deck carrier, but with no island, and then later on still being converted into a carrier with the addition of a small island on one side to help with navigation. So her start and finish point is sort of from small battle cruiser to carrier, rather than the sort of 3 or 4 step process of Kitakami, but her intermediate stages were quite radical as well. And, well, it's actually difficult to think of other ships that might have had as extreme changes, or as extreme a change history. There are ships that have had significant and massive changes, and some of the more modern US Navy hospital ships, for instance, starting off as oil tankers, now hospital ships with radically different appearances. The conversions from battle cruisers and ocean liners and so forth into aircraft carriers, coast defense battleships becoming freighters, but Kitakami going through 4 very distinct separate roles, or, well, if the transport role is kind of landing a few of the torpedo launchers, it's kind of a halfway house, so let's say 3.5 conversions. That is somewhat harder to find. The closest you could find for that en masse would be some escort carriers, which were either built as cargo ships or merchant ships, converted either post-construction or during construction to carriers, and then switched back again to merchant vessels at the end of the war. So that's a sort of a 3-step process, albeit that the start and end results are very similar to each other. Perhaps you could argue something like USS Mississippi, standard battleship with the cage masts, then a more modern vessel refitted in World War II, very different capabilities and a fairly radically different appearance, and then going on to be a ship with almost one of every gun in the US fleet plus missile launchers. Might be a competitor there. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, what went wrong during the 1711 Quebec Expedition, and if it went as planned, what impact could it have had on colonial North America? So, well, what briefly went wrong was the gentleman in charge of the expedition decided to try and make his way up a river estuary in deep fog when there was strong winds and currents, and basically, well, that's a disaster even these days unless you have GPS, and possibly even then, let alone given the fact he had no particularly accurate charts of the area nor any local knowledge of the area. So the fact that he only lost 7 or 8 of his ships out of his entire fleet is probably actually more of a miracle than anything else. And, between that and the lack of supplies being provided in the first place, the planned assault, which was to take Quebec and that area of what was then New France, failed, and Quebec would only fall to the British about half a century later. Now, if the entire expedition had gone as planned, i.e. they'd been able to take on enough supplies in Boston to last during the campaign season, and either the fog hadn't been there, or they'd done the sensible thing and anchored in the fog until the fog cleared, and therefore, if we assume that they were able to successfully take and hold Quebec and the surrounding area, then there was a few fairly interesting potential implications for colonial North America. Assuming that it doesn't get traded back to France in some subsequent peace treaty, and that it all gets, occupied and becomes part of British North America as a whole, whilst it may not entirely avoid the American War of Independence, it would probably remove a fair number of the fuses that caused that war in the first place. Now, obviously, taking Quebec and its surrounding area doesn't entirely eliminate French holdings in Canada, but if the British are determined to hold on to it thereafter, it really does kind of rip the heart out of remaining French efforts in North America, at least anything that's north of Louisiana. So it's possible, and this is a hypothetical, it's possible that the French might give up what is now Canada, known as Canada, their holdings there as a bad job, cede them to Britain in exchange for getting something else back somewhere else. At which point the French-speaking population of Canada is going to be significantly smaller, and subsequent populations, even if they try and maintain their French identity the way that the Quebecois, the people who live in Quebec, these days have tried to do, even if they try and maintain that, A, it'll be a lot longer in time for them to do that, and B, there'll be far fewer of them. But that's rather more of an aside to the fact that if pretty much all of Canada is under British control, then the French and Indian Wars that precede the American War of Independence don't happen. Britain will still be at war with France, but that conflict isn't going to spread into the deep heartlands of North America. And that has a twofold effect. One is that the war is cheaper for the British to fight, and they have slightly more territory to generate resources and income from, and therefore the need to claw back some of that investment is lessened. Because they haven't had to spend large amounts of money fighting to secure the 13 colonies and the various other bits of Canada that they had at the time historically, then obviously with it being less expensive, and more precisely less expensive in that area, there's far less need and far less justification to try and get some of that money back via taxation, which means that there'll be less tension with the rest of the North American colonists down in the 13 colonies. And the other side of that coin is that even if there is rising tension, with the North American colonies not having fought any major conflict for at least 50 years, then you have people like George Washington and so forth, and general rank and file in the American colonies who historically now had military experience in the original timeline, don't have direct military experience in this timeline, unless they sign up and go overseas or something. So, there's far less reason for some of the disputes between the 13 colonies and the rest of the British Empire at the time. B, what disputes may still arise, such as taxes on tea, to help out the East India Company, will have a much narrower effect than the historically running disputes did. And C, such rebels as there are will be far less well equipped and far less experienced, which may therefore mean that either the War of American Independence doesn't happen at that point in time, or if it does, it fails. And the knock-on implications of Britain then heading on into its main imperial period, still holding on to essentially all the relevant parts of North America bar Louisiana and Florida, that's quite an interesting counterfactual. HMS Inadvisable asks, I'm wondering if you should put the definite article "the" before a ship's name if you do not use a prefix like HMS or USS. My search led me to some heated discussion online, but I would appreciate your input. For example, is the Warspite broke free correct, or Warspite broke free correct? As you said, it is something of a matter of a heated debate. I think, personally, and at least from what I remember from my rules of English grammar as well, it comes down to, are you treating the ship as an object or as, effectively speaking, a person, i.e. an identity? So if you're treating the ship's name as an identity and the ship is a unique entity, then you wouldn't use "the", for the same reason that you wouldn't use "the" for people. If take the sentence, I know, Dave runs up a hill, you might have, maybe he's General Dave, so you wouldn't use "the General Dave ran up the hill," but equally if you omitted general, the title, i.e. like you're omitting HMS or USS, saying "the Dave ran up the hill," you can immediately hear doesn't make sense. So the Warspite broke free, if you're treating the name as a unique entity's identification, then no, you wouldn't. However, the flip side is that if you are treating the ship as an object and its name is just a designation for that object, then technically speaking, "the" could be correct. So if we were, if you were to take something like, say, my car, then you could say the Volvo has rolled downhill. Saying at that point Volvo has rolled downhill, that doesn't make any sense because Volvo is just an object. Or the XC60 has rolled downhill. XC60 has rolled downhill is, again, it doesn't sound quite right for various obvious reasons. So yeah, I think it comes down to where you stand on the ship's name and how that relates to the ship being an entity or an object. For the most part, as a general rule of thumb, you don't use "the". You would just use the ship's name. So Warspite broke free, Enterprise sailed to Japan, and so on and so forth. But I think if you were ever going to use the definite article, then it would have to be in specific situations which relate to it kind of relates to the ship as a kind of a living entity. For the sake of the hyperbolic argument, obviously it is a collection of steel, but you could construct an argument, say, that would be a ship that's in commission with crew and is sailing around, i.e. is an active warship, should not have "the" because it's an active thing. But perhaps a ship that has been decommissioned and is under tow for scrap, and therefore it's an empty, inert thing, or a ship that's sunk and is a wreck is also an empty, inert thing that just now has a designation. If you made that argument, and if you stuck to that argument, then technically as an object, I guess you could call it that. So You could say Bismarck, Fort HMS Hood, Bismarck, Fort HMS Rodney. The Bismarck is a wreck on the ocean floor. That you could make an argument for that. Others would argue that Bismarck is always Bismarck, Kirishima is always Kirishima, Hood is always Hood. Therefore, you should always say Hood without the definite article, even if you're just talking about a lump of inert metal at the bottom of the ocean or whatever. And then you get down into the weeds of defining what a ship's name counts as in terms of your sentence structure by the rest of the sentence, which, that can get even more tricky. Because, say you're talking about the Battle of Trafalgar, if you're talking about the actions of victory, you would talk about victory without the. But if, for example, you were making a technical statement about the amount of damage that the vessel had taken, again, you could make an argument for saying the victory had sustained significant damage, because damage is something, generally speaking, hopefully, that happens to an object. But yeah, this is the problem with the English language. It's so convoluted. You can make a number of niche case arguments for using the, but as a broad brush rule, don't use the, because saying victory took damage, Hood is on the ocean floor, or Rodney was sailing after Gneisenau, these are all valid. People won't question them. But if you start applying the in certain specific instances where you could argue that the vessel is an object rather than a subject, then you might win the argument, but you won't win the argument with everybody, and it'll just cause issues. Wienwe asks, the Austro-Hungarian Panzerkutter No. 1 Linz has made the rounds on the internet lately. Is this the smallest armoured warship ever, and if not, then what was? I mean, it's going to be in pretty close contention for the position of smallest armoured warship. I mean, there are some very, very small river monitors, and there are some armoured patrol boats from World War II on the Eastern Front, some of the Russian ones with T-34, T-28 tank turrets on them and so forth, that might be in the same ballpark. But, well, one, information on the Linz here is sparse, to say the least, but just eyeballing it from the relative size of the men aboard her, she's got to be in contention for being one of the world's smallest armoured vessels, if not the smallest. It'll basically come down to if someone can dig up her dimensions and displacements, but if she's under 30 tons or so, then yes, she would be the smallest armoured warship. Andy Watkins asks, World War I era warships had quite long-range guns, and the capital ships had the rangefinders to utilise those ranges. But what about destroyers and light cruisers? Presumably most of their weaponry was sighted by eye. What was the effective range of such weapons with primitive or no fire control? I can find information on battleship rangefinding equipment, but nothing on World War I era light warships. So, part of the reason is that it's not particularly well chronicled outside of a very, very few select sources, but also it depends greatly on the class of ship and the time period in World War I, because World War I was basically the period where both rangefinders and direct-to-fire control equipment was either being fitted or refitted in better forms onto various ships, obviously priority given to capital ships, but in progressing in waves further and further down. So, for example, in 1914 in the Royal Navy, as far as fire control equipment goes, on destroyers there aren't rangefinders. But in 1918, there are. The breakpoint being 1916, when M-class destroyers were used as a test bed to determine if you could put a rangefinder that was worth anything on a destroyer. Turned out yes, and then rangefinders started to be issued, along with other fire control equipment. And similarly for cruisers, bigger cruisers lent themselves much better, and depending on what you're prioritising as well, to the installation of rangefinders of various sizes and then stepping down through the various classes. So you might find a period where a big armoured cruiser might have a rangefinder. another armoured cruiser from the same class might not have a rangefinder in the same year. Or you might find yourself where, say, a C-class or a Town class 1910 variant cruiser might have a rangefinder fitted, but a Nareth user class, again, World War I variant, might not. And, and then, of course, whether or not there's any kind of fire control equipment to go with the rangefinder also varies quite considerably. So, yeah, if you're looking at a 1914 battle, like, say, First Heligoland Bight, between destroyers and cruisers on both sides, the vast majority of ships in that case are not going to have any kind of fire control related rangefinders aboard. But by the last time battles were fought in that area in 1918, pretty much everybody was carrying something at least. And, various conflicts in between have an even weirder and more wonderful balance of things. But you've also got gunnery tables. So you can use the gunnery tables to kind of help you guess the range based on what you think, plus you go, and then to match that range to your weaponry, you can then go, okay, well, I think this destroyer is at 6,000 yards range. If you're in another destroyer, and then you go, right, gunnery table, if I elevate my gun to X number of degrees, that is 6,000 yards range. And, let's say bearing 070, according to my gunnery calculation table book, if he's at 5,000 yards and I think he's going at 25 knots, then I need to offset by, not a precise figure, but just using an arbitrary number, I need to offset by 2 degrees, so he's going that way, so we're going to set the gun to bearing 072 and fire. Oh, okay, that fell a little bit short, so maybe we need to lead it by maybe another half degree, and by short I mean behind the ship, as in behind it to the left, let's say, if the ship's travelling to the right, and then maybe the shell went a bit over, so maybe my range estimate was off a bit, so drop the gun by a degree or two and try again, and so on and so forth, basically kind of eyeballing in a similar kind of in your head calculations to what a fire control table would do. But yeah, generally speaking, cruisers and destroyers engaged at reasonably closer ranges than the capital ships did, with obviously the caveat that whilst they may not have had full fire control rangefinders aboard, that didn't stop people from bringing their own instrumentation aboard. It certainly didn't stop people having binoculars and telescopes aboard, and whilst they're not as useful for estimating range, if you do want to fire beyond the kind of 1,000 yards-ish maximum estimation of the average human eye, a telescope is quite useful because, again, you make your estimates, check your gunnery tables, make fire, and then your telescope or binoculars in theory allow you to make, relatively speaking, at least accurate observations of the fall of shot, which allow you to correct things. But still, ideally, you close the range for closer in combat. It's a very messy period for this kind of thing. Matt Blom asks, at its peak, the Venetian arsenal reportedly could manufacture a new galley every single day. What, if any, design differences exist for this mass-produced galley versus its contemporaries, and can you briefly describe how the Venetians engineered standardised parts into this design? Well, design differences between contemporary galleys and a Venetian mass-produced galley. Initially, Venetian galleys were under the mass production regime, were some of the first to introduce what we now recognise as the standard way of producing wooden ships, i.e. you build the frame first and then put, planks over it, as opposed to the older school method, which was you built the hull and then you used the frames to hold the hull together. That made Venetian galleys a little bit stronger, although obviously this system would spread, so it would only be relatively a unique difference between a Venetian galley and other contemporary galley for a relatively brief time period, but it did exist. That's the main element. I mean, other than that, a Venetian mass-produced galley was a Mediterranean galley. Obviously, there's not as much variation between it and other contemporary galleys, or between its sister ships and other contemporary galleys, for obvious reasons, because it's a mass-produced vessel, not an individually handcrafted one. But in terms of how they engineered standardized parts into its design, well, partly doing the frame first helped quite significantly, because it meant that once you put the hull planking on, the hull planking generally had to conform to the frame, as opposed to building the hull first. The hull will settle and warp slightly differently on every ship, so you have to make changes and construct the frames to the hull, rather, which, you know, is going to be a bespoke process every time. But the other element was, of course, by separating the production processes themselves. So you have a standard design for frames, you have a standard design for planks to fit that frame, for mast to fit the hull, and so on and so forth. And instead of just manufacturing it once and then maybe designing another one, or manufacturing a few and then designing another design, you have, okay, right, you lot, you're going to build this frame, or these frames. You're going to build these other frames. You're going to make the planks. You're going to do the keel. You're going to do the masts, and just repeatedly do that. Whereas under more conventional shipyards, the same set of carpenters might find themselves making the keel one day, then working on the frames, then working on the planks, etc., etc. This way, under the Venetian method, you could have a smaller subset of carpenters and workmen constantly making frames to the same size and specification, and another set of workmen constantly making masts to the same size and specification, and so on and so forth. Which then means, obviously, they make the individual parts, they put them out, and they get put together, they get constructed in basically approximately exactly the same way. And as these individualized components move down the line, they get put together into a ship, and there's another ship that's practically identical coming along behind it. That's a very, very short, brief summary. But yeah, so a typical Venetian mass-produced galley in its early forms would be a bit stronger than your average galley, and in its later forms would have a lot more interoperability with its fellows than the average galley. Paul Gray asks, how do aircraft carriers, etc., determine wind direction and speed whilst making headway? Well, obviously these days, you know, ships do have access to a number of different systems to do it, but back in the time period the channel covers, there's a few ways depending on the strength of the wind, because yeah, while you're making headway, technically if the air is still and you're moving through it at, let's say, 25-30 knots, then you are, if you're, for the average man on the deck, you're generating the feel of a 25 to 30 knot wind coming forwards. But if there's, say, a 30 knot wind that's coming in from the side, whether that be port or starboard, whilst you're moving ahead, you are still going to feel that. You can look at flags and weather vanes, and there you will show the cumulative effect of those two winds. But you might have a situation where you're moving at 30 knots and the wind speed at the moment is 10 knots, let's say, and that may not have such a noticeable effect. So again, there's a few ways you can look out for that. A very crude indication is to look where the ship's smoke is going, because obviously once the smoke has risen a certain distance from your funnel, it's independent of your ship and affected much more by the local wind conditions than your forward movement. So if you look back at your smoke plume and you notice, that smoke plume is moving off to port, then you know that you have a wind coming in from your starboard side of some description. You've obviously also got wind and weather reports that you will have received earlier, and between all of that, plus obviously as you get more towards World War II, various technological measures, you can work out roughly what direction the wind is coming from and then turn towards that. Literally just looking at a weather vane or a flag is also quite useful, because if you have any wind whatsoever, then you will be able to tell by the effect on that. I mean, you could quite literally just say, okay, let's turn the ship until the weather vane and the flag are streaming directly behind us, then we are aligned with the wind because there is no other effects on those. That'd be as a crude way of doing it. You can also do things like dropping smoke floats, or getting aircraft to drop smoke floats, or just looking at where the clouds are going. There are all sorts of measures that you can either use exclusively or in combination. DM Phoenix asks, the famous mystery of the merchant ship Mary Celeste and her missing crew has mystified naval historians and researchers since 1872. Multiple theories arose over the years, ranging from natural causes like water spouts to the intriguing pirate attack, foul play, murder, mutiny, etc., to the absurd, such as giant octopus attack. More recent theories have also pointed towards the ship's flammable cargo of industrial alcohol playing a role. As we near the 150th anniversary of this event, what theory do you subscribe to that fits all the facts of this mysterious case? Well, like you said, there are so many competing theories, and even once you eliminate the ones that are just completely implausible and ridiculous, there's a reasonable number of similar or related theories that might all equally be valid, because all we know really is that the people that were aboard weren't on board. There was no signs of a rapid evacuation, and a boat was missing, and the captain's navigation instruments were missing. Now, the only thing that really tells me definitively is that they probably left the ship deliberately and in good order, because why else would you take the navigation instruments? The fact that the ship was still well stocked with food, supplies, provisions, etc., well, we don't know how much they would have taken into their boat. It could be, you've got theories that perhaps they were intending to let some build-up of vapours from their cargo pass after maybe a small explosion in the hold, so they wanted to, just be towed along behind the ship for a while and wait for the vapours to clear. Why they take the navigation instruments in that case, I'm not entirely sure. But then, obviously, the theory of the rope slips or whatever. Maybe they thought they were just flat out evacuating the ship based on perhaps on an incorrect idea of where they were, possibly because of the explosion. Maybe they thought it was going to blow up or whatever. I mean, the ship was somewhat damaged, not hugely, but the sails and rigging weren't in the best shape. There was some water ingress indicating it had gone through a degree of foul weather to an extent. I'm not sure what happened to the ship. So there's probably 3 or 4 different theories, all of which fit the existing facts, all of which are plausible. If I had to add my own reflections on it, then the only thing that I would add, in addition to everything else that has been discussed in various other iterations of what may not have happened to the ship, is that if it's got this cargo of, I think it's alcohol in its hold, and that's obviously outgassing, maybe causing small explosions and things, and maybe a big one that disturbs a hatch. Something that perhaps people haven't necessarily taken account of is that if you have a whole massive cargo on after all, a relatively small ship, and it is letting off a lot of vapours, enough to cause these kinds of issues, then that is probably going to permeate the rest of the atmosphere on the ship, which in turn is going to make the crew somewhat intoxicated on a permanent basis. They're literally breathing aerosolized alcohol, which may then have considerably affected their judgment. So if then there's something like, a small explosion of vapours or whatever, that realistically, if they're in their right minds, they would have said, part of the nature of transporting a cargo like this in those kind of times. But with their senses somewhat addled, they might have played up in their heads enough for them to think, no, we've got to get out of here now, make them a bit panicky and jumpy. And the only thing they think to take is the navigation instruments, because they're not completely off their heads. So we've got to navigate our way home by something other than this. The ship's a ticking time bomb, that kind of thing. And off they go. And then maybe a squall blows up or something like that, which would account for the damage to the rigging and so forth and the water ingress, and also why they weren't, once they came to their senses, being away from the ship, why they weren't able to regain the ship, because if a squall comes along, it could have just tipped the little boat they launched straight over, dumped them into the sea, or even if it didn't, it could have just, motored the Mary Celeste much further than they would ever be able to catch up with it. And then you end up with this slightly damaged abandoned ship that everybody finds sometime later. Those would be my only thoughts. Andrew Waite asks, thank you for calculating where a shell fired from the Fort Nelson 14-inch gun would land. To the east of Fort Nelson, along the ridgeline of ports downhill, is Fort Widley, which has a rifle-muzzled loading 9-inch 12-ton muzzle-loading gun prominently displayed outside. Would a shot from this gun land on the tax office at Link's house in Cosham? Fort Widley is at an elevation of about 100 metres. Well, I said I do love these questions, so here it is. Now, according to my protractor measurements of this gun, it appears to be elevated at approximately 8 degrees, which, according to the range table for this particular kind of gun, it means that it should have a range of approximately 4,300 yards if fired. That is allowing for the elevation, which is the equivalent of 3,931.92, or so 3,932 meters. And then using Google Maps, because the satellite then shows the alignment of it, and extending that out 3,932 meters into the rest of the area, it would suggest that, in fact, it's going to go well past Cosham. In fact, it's going to go sailing over Cosham entirely, and it then becomes a very, very bad day to be living at 27 Kenyon Road down in Portsmouth, unfortunately. Give or take a little bit of windage, it might take out a garden shed or car in the front, but believe it or not, the alignment is actually pretty much spot on for there. Although if you do happen to be the inhabitant of 27 Kenyon Road, you might be gratified to know that with the angle of descent, it's probably going to wipe out 31 and 33's roof on the way through. Nick Brodar asks, how effective was disruptive camouflage - dazzle paint? Is there a decent book on the subject? Now, the data is a little bit difficult to actually interpret because, unfortunately, a lot of the ships that were considered very important in World War I, when dazzle camouflage were first into the scene, were the ones that were dazzle camoed, and other smaller, less important ships weren't, which brings another variable in. There weren't, all ships of, say, 10,000 tons displacement with half in dazzle and half in not. It was a case like most of the big important ships had some form of disruptive camo on them, and a lot of the smaller ones didn't, so at which point are the attack ratios and the hit ratios, etc., related to their size rather than their camouflage? There are other sets of data, though, that where the amount of ships camouflaged is a little bit more holistic across the board, so you can draw some conclusions from that. But in terms of effectiveness, there are some first-hand accounts from U-boat captains who say that actually it was very difficult to work out, one, where the ship they were looking at was actually going, and two, whether the ship they were looking at was actually a ship or a couple of ships sailing close together. So that seems to indicate from the intended target's end that it was working. And when you look at the data, as I said, with the caveats mentioned earlier, it does appear that whilst having the camouflage applied slightly increased the chances of being attacked in the first place, which, okay, is relatively obvious because if their dazzle camo schemes are fairly garish, they're going to be a bit easier to spot. But even with that, compared to the number of ships that were attacked when they were just in standard paint schemes, fewer dazzle camoed ships were hit than proportionally compared to the number of non-camouflage ships hit, and of those that were hit, fewer of them were hit dead center, which seems to indicate that whilst it made it slightly easier to actually see these ships as targets in the first place, it seems to indicate that it was considerably more likely that the torpedo would miss, or even if the captain somehow saw through part of the camo, they would only score sort of a hit on the bow or stern, which might still kill the ship, but it might not, and even if it did kill the ship, it's more likely the ship would take longer to sink. So overall, I think it would actually be, you could consider it to be relatively effective. Now, in terms of a decent book on the subject, there is one, Naval Camouflage 1914 to 1945, a complete visual reference. It does cover other camouflage schemes than Dazzle, but it covers that in a fair bit of detail as well. It's by a chap called David L. Williams, published by the US Navy Institute Press. And the USNI currently has another book which is actually specifically about Dazzle camouflage. It's called Dazzle, Disguise and Disruption in War and Art, by James Taylor, and that's available, as I say, right now on the US Navy Institute's website. And of course, you can get a nice chunk of money by using the code DRACH, D-R-A-C-H. Robert Marmotstein asks, on the Great Plains, buffalo chips were sometimes used as an alternative fuel for heating and cooking. Were coal, oil, and wood the only fuels used by naval vessels in the period covered by this channel, or were there other fuels that could be used in emergencies? So, for the most part, when we're talking about steamships, yes, coal, oil, and wood are the only regular fuels used by Navy vessels. They are not necessarily the only fuels, though. So, your bunkers, especially with oil, they're designed to hold liquid. You're not really going to get much else out of that. Although, as the Japanese would prove in World War II, whilst bunker fuel is not exactly the world's nicest fuel, you can, in a pinch, use something even nastier, which is basic crude oil, if you have to, in an oil-burning ship. And in a ship that burns solids, like coal and wood, again, you would almost always use coal if you could, but if worse came to worse and you needed the fires to burn and you were running out of coal or whatever, then yeah, you could chuck wood in, you could chuck in anything that will burn relatively well. Hay, cloth, basically. You'd burn through that kind of stuff pretty darn quickly, but if it was your only alternative to keep your engines working, well, then you do that and keep your engines working as best you could until you could get somewhere where you could resupply with something more approximating a reasonable fuel. But at least aboard naval ships, this was the case. There are various stories, especially in the late 19th century, of various steamship companies experimenting with using locally available fuels that might be different from that, like the aforementioned animal leavings and so forth. But when they were ever used, it would have been most likely in small coastal trade. If you want to go out across the ocean in a relatively large ship, you do need some fairly energy dense, hopefully relatively low after-product fuels, and hydrocarbons are pretty much the way to go on that. Sina asks, what is considered the first effective class of submarine? I assume it's a U-boat from World War I, but that may not be the case. And believe it or not, of all the major combatants in World War I, the Germans were the second last to get submarines. Only the Austro-Hungarians were later than them. The Italians, the French, the Japanese, the Russians, the British, and the Americans all had effective submarines, for whatever your given definition version of effective is, several years, in some cases almost a decade, before the Germans commissioned their first submarine into the Kaiserliche Marine. Now, as far as effective class, as I say, it depends exactly how you define it. Do you define it as it was a class of submarines accepted into naval service that could fulfill a useful military role? In which case the first effective class would be the Holland class, which made its debut, as you can see here, in the United States, followed shortly thereafter by a debut in the Royal Navy, and then, well, with a lot of other naval powers, including the Japanese. So, they could dive, they were relatively reliable, they could come up again, they had a useful enough range, but they were obviously confined to coastal operation harbour defence work because of their small size, and they were single hull submarines. So, some would classify them as the first effective class of subs, others would disagree. Then you have, if you want to classify them as the double hull, which is basically what you see for 99% of all submarines ever built. So you have the internal pressure hull and then an external casing that serves to streamline the sub, conceal ballast tanks and all that other good stuff. Well, for that, you'd have to wind the clock forward just a fraction, at which point the French become the first people with a quote-unquote effective submarine in the form of the Naval. But then you might want to say, well, actually, I don't want a steam-powered or petrol-powered submarine as the first effective one. I want a diesel-electric. Well, that would be the French again. Egret. And, well, there's a few others that try to compete for the title of diesel-electric, but they're all around about the same time. And then, of course, if you want to shift the goalposts even further, you can say, oh, well, actually, I want by effective submarine, I mean an ocean-going sub, not something that's limited to coastal and harbour defence by its size and speed and endurance, in which case the British might pick it up with the D-class, which are being built and coming into service around about the time that the Germans are just experimenting with the very first of their subs, the U-1. Dr. Irrelevant asks, I was recently watching your video on the Caribbean in World War II, and I was surprised to learn that Italian submarines were present. I'd always thought of Italy as being stuck in the Mediterranean. What role did Italy play in the Battle of the Atlantic? Additionally, did Japan play any role in the Battle of the Atlantic? Well, as far as the role that the Italians played in the Atlantic, I will say spoiler alert for a video that's going to be upcoming in the next few weeks where I will be discussing that in a fair bit more detail. But for the minute, the very, very brief version is that yes, the Italians did have a small but relatively important submarine force in the Atlantic. They had a number of quite large, fairly well-equipped ocean-going submarines. Now, of course, they didn't do too well in the Mediterranean for various reasons, but they were deployed to Bordeaux, and they're based out of there, and they would go back and forth and conduct operations in the Atlantic for a while. There wasn't anything particularly wrong with the Italian subs. As I said, some of them were quite capable. There also wasn't anything particularly wrong with the Italian crews training in terms of how to attack enemy shipping. They certainly had comparable success to the average U-boat. Where they did have problems, though, was their operational technique. So they did have a rather distressing habit of radioing in their intentions all the time, which made them somewhat easier to track down and kill. Plus, of course, they were supposed to be cooperating with the Germans, but the Kriegsmarine was a little bit precious about who they assigned to where. So a lot of the sort of richest hunting grounds, as it were, such as the early stages of the Caribbean and the US Eastern Seaboard, tended to get assigned to U-boats, even if, strictly speaking, Italian submarines might have actually been able to do a better job than some of the U-boats that were assigned there. Certainly when it came to Type 7s. Now, as far as Japan playing a role in the Battle of the Atlantic, no, they didn't. The only contribution that the Japanese gave to the Battle of the Atlantic was by causing the expenditure of some ammunition when one of their cargo subs and then an ex-German U-boat, which technically had been commissioned into the Japanese Navy, both of which were trying to run cargo missions clandestinely to and from Germany to Japan, were caught and sunk by American sub-hunting groups. And yeah, so apart from the expenditure of some hedgehogs and depth charges, that was the sum total of the Imperial Japanese Navy's contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic. John McCarthy asks, after the Battle of Jutland, Jellicoe was often criticised for not achieving a Trafalgar-like total victory. Presumably his critics had suggestions for what he could have done differently. What were the ideas which might have had the most effect on the outcome, and what is your opinion on the practicality of each? Well, there are as many suggestions about what Jellicoe should have done at Trafalgar as there are days in a year, but you have to filter them some way. An awful lot of Jellicoe should have done X rely on Jellicoe knowing what the heck was going on, which, thanks to lack of communication from BT amongst others, he didn't. So, it's all very well saying, well, Jellicoe should have deployed earlier. He had no idea what the High Seas Fleet was doing earlier. He still didn't know what the High Seas Fleet was doing when he gave his deployment order, but he was making a best guess based on the information he had to hand, which wasn't a lot. And, things like he should have gone for the entrance to the German minefields the Germans were actually going for. Yes, technically speaking, he was informed of that by Admiralty signals, but as we've discussed in previous Drydock episodes and in the Battle of Jutland series, by that point he had very little reason to trust what the Admiralty was sending to him in signals, and a lot of the information the Admiralty should have sent him via signals, which would have actually confirmed that particular instance they were correct, they didn't send to him. So it's kind of a very technical, he should have done X, but in hindsight maybe, but in practical terms, looking at how things were developing at the time, he actually probably would have been almost derelict in his duty if he'd suddenly decided to start believing a bunch of signals data that up until that point had a fairly catastrophic streak of being wrong. So give him better intel, give the Admiralty a bit more of a brainstem when it comes to transmitting all the data they've intercepted, etc., and Jellicoe can do Jutland a lot better. But without that, and without some of his men communicating with him at night, there is a limited amount that he can do. There's probably only 2 points though where I would say, potentially, reasonably speaking, there are points of departure where he could have done better. The first, more minor one is during the night action, because Jellicoe's ship could see and hear some of the flashes and gunfire from the Germans crossing the back end of the Grand Fleet's column. Now, given that he made a very good judgment call earlier in the day based on very limited data, you could in theory argue that perhaps Jellicoe could have made another similar judgment call at that point, realised the Germans were cutting across the back of his fleet, at which point their destination would have been very obvious, and he could have had the Grand Fleet and the battlecruisers waiting for the Germans to straggle in across that line come dawn. So that's one potential way he could have that's one of the few practical ways he could have improved the outcome. The other one involves basically taking a huge gamble, but one that theoretically might actually have paid off. So, as we know, at Jutland, he was sailing vaguely south, more like southwest, when he decided which direction he was going to deploy the Grand Fleet in. And that was in a battle line that was kind of a little bit crooked, but generally speaking headed west to meet the oncoming German ships, who were generally speaking heading north. It's not exactly the alignments they're on, but you get the general drift. That meant that he crossed the German T. It meant that Scheer turned away with his battle turn away. So all good. Pretty much the best maneuver he could have made under conventional tactics at the time. However, Admiral Sturdy had a number of different ideas, as he always did, which is why Jellicoe was keeping him very close to stop him running off and doing something incredibly stupid. But one of Sturdy's ideas was to split the Grand Fleet into 2 groups and try and pincer the Germans. So individually each element would be slightly weaker than the High Seas Fleet, but as long as Sturdy's manoeuvre worked out the way he thought it would, they would envelop the Germans, at which point the Germans would be very hard pressed. Well, they couldn't really engage on both sides. Theoretically you can swivel your turrets one way and the other, but your primary rangefinder fire control systems can only point one way at a time. Anyway, whilst there are numerous ways that particular manoeuvre could have gone horribly wrong, when you look at the way the Grand Fleet was aligned and set out, given that Jellicoe did make the call that he reckoned that the German fleet was going to show up somewhere a little bit to the east of his position, and hence his deployment heading east. In theory, if he decided he was going to throw his entire previous wartime career of being a cautious and deliberate planner who tried to get as much information as possible before making this decision, he'd thrown all of that out the window and gone, you know what, double or nothing, give me 4d6 and hope for sixes on all counts. Yes, it's a long shot, but you asked for practicality, and in terms of could it actually have been pulled off with a relatively simple change of orders that doesn't require foreknowledge? Yes, it could. And that would have been to take his ships and every squadron of ships that was to the east of him and basically do his original maneuver, i.e. taking into a battle line heading, roughly speaking, east, but then giving Sturdy command of every ship that was west of his division. So you split the ground fleet in half as per Sturdy's requests, and you get those ships to sail basically south, maybe south by southeast, but essentially that. So you'd have an approximate course once Jellicoe's portion of the ground fleet has straightened itself out, of roughly east by southeast, and Sturdy going kind of south or south by southeast. And if he'd done that around about the time that he historically did the his actual maneuver, then Scheer would still have been confronted by a mysterious dark grey battle line to his north pelting shells at him, and probably still would have made the battle turn away because he couldn't see what the heck was shooting at him at first. And this is where the practicality element comes in. Critically speaking, not all of the Grand Fleet's battle line was actually engaged, and of the stuff that was, some of it wasn't engaged very, very, very much because visibility was so limited. So by taking the tail end of the Grand Fleet, which didn't have all that much to do anyway, to be honest, during that first engagement, and sending it, roughly speaking, south, you could actually end up with a pincer maneuver developing, which would be very bad for Scheer, because if he does his battle turn away thinking he is facing the Grand Fleet, then he is going to be doing a battle turn away into the guns of Sturdy's half of the fleet. And Sturdy's half of the fleet would have been potentially happily chowing down on the Nassaus and Helgolands and Deutschlands by that point, which may have given Scheer some warning. But the thing is, if they give Scheer some warning, help, we're under attack, well, that's not going to save them that much. And then Scheer is left with, his 2 and a bit modern squadrons plus what's left of first scouting group facing off against Jellicoe, who still significantly outnumbers him, while his weaker tail end gets chewed up by Sturdy. Or he does his battle turn away, in which case, well, he's basically going to end up ping-ponging, because he's turned away from Jellicoe pounding him just to run into Sturdy, who would then be in a target-rich environment. Now, the only way it could go possibly slightly wrong is if Sturdy gets a little bit target-fixated on dealing with the Deutschlands, Nassaus and Helgolands, and doesn't notice the Kaisers and Königs and first scouting group bearing down on him, which would give the Germans temporary local superiority if Scheer does his battle turn away. The flip side is, of course, if Sturdy is keeping an eye out and spots them doing that, then he can communicate to Jellicoe that this is what's happening, and Jellicoe can just be right on the tail of Scheer, at which point Scheer is trapped in between the two halves of the Grand Fleet, and he's probably not getting away. There'll probably be a fair number of losses on the Royal Navy side as well, because after all, a cornered prey is very, very dangerous. But it's not exactly like Nelson's fleet at Trafalgar came out unscathed either, now is it? So that might have had a rather spectacular effect on the outcome. Huge gamble, though. John McDonough asks, I've just read a short summary, Warship Losses of World War II by David Brown, of a battle between France and Thailand, or Siam as it was at the time, in the Ko Chang estuary of the Thai-Cambodia border in January 1941. I'd like to know more about the Thai ships that participated. I know they were coast defence ships and torpedo boats built in the mid-1930s. Did the Thai Navy design and build them, or were they purchased from another source? And since the battle was so one-sided, France 5, Thailand 0, what were they thinking fighting the French? I know the French were much reduced by this point, but did they really believe France was not going to fight at all? So there's two parts to that question. Firstly, in terms of the ship's origins, the torpedo boats were Italian. They were purchased from Italy, built in Italy, and obviously sent to Thailand. And the two coastal defence ships had been built by the Japanese. So they'd ordered both sets of ships. Now, as far as the battle being fairly one-sided and why that happened, and why they believe France wouldn't fight at all, well, they did think that France would fight, but you have to consider the circumstances. So at this point, Thailand is roughly allied with Japan. Japan has taken advantage of the fall of mainland France and the establishment of the Vichy French government to occupy portions of French Indochina, which it borders onto Thailand, and the French have given in. The Japanese have taken over a variety of bases in French Indochina. The army that the French have in Indochina is smaller and less well equipped than the Thai army. The Air Force is smaller and less well equipped than the Thai Air Force. And on paper, the Thai Navy outnumbers the French Navy that's present there, because the French have a handful of what they call avisos, what everyone else would call sloops, and one light cruiser, and the Thais have a few more ships than that. The actual overall war goes actually fairly well for the Thai armed forces. They defeat, broadly speaking, the French ground forces. Their air force has superiority, and indeed the French are actually worried during this naval operation that the Thai air force might come and sink their ships regardless of what else happens. But because the land-air battle is going so badly for the French Indochina authorities, they decide to send their one trump card, the Navy element, to try and do coastal bombardment in an effort to draw Thai troops away from the land war. And in so doing, they obviously send out the Lamopike, the light cruiser, and 4 of the avisos. And this is where you have two factors. So firstly, it's a surprise attack. The Thai Navy doesn't know this attack is coming. So when the French show up at the crack of dawn, the Thai ships are at anchor and haven't worked up steam. So, initially they're caught completely stationary, and then later on they're only just about able to get moving. Whereas the French are obviously cleared and ready for action. And secondly, whilst in terms of numbers of hulls, everything looks like it might be in favour of the Thai Navy, in terms of overall displacement, it really isn't. The 2 Thai coastal defence ships plus the torpedo boats all added together displace less than just Lamopike. And the 4 sloops that it has with it are also significantly bigger than the torpedo boats. So there's 2 smaller sloops in the kind of the 800-900 ton range, and 2 much larger Bougainville class sloops, which are around about 2,000 tons, whereas the torpedo boats are just fractionally over 300 tons. And then, of course, Lamopike is pushing 8,000 tons, and the 2 coastal defence ships are about 2,250 apiece. So, yeah, the fact that the Lamopike was able to do a degree of damage to one of the Thai coastal defence ships and sink 2 of the torpedo boats and damage a bunch of others, not exactly massively surprising. Although, with that being said, given that the coastal defence ships were armed with 8-inch guns, and basically in terms of the big ships engaged, the 2 coastal defence ships and the light cruiser, nobody had armour to defeat the other's weaponry, it would be much more of an interesting fight had the Thai Navy known that the French were coming. Maybe an aerial reconnaissance mission or something had spotted them. Because if you have 2 ships able to engage Lamour Piquet, then of course one of them theoretically is going to have open season field sights on the French ship, and it's a very confined coastal environment that this battle takes place in. They're actually, even in the historic battle, forced to stop firing relatively often because small islands and such are getting in the way, and of course those torpedo boats, whilst very small and vulnerable, are capable of reasonably high speed, and high speed is one thing that the sloops definitely are not capable of. So, yeah, in confined coastal waters with lots of cover, if they'd been up to speed, there's a reasonable chance they might have been able to torpedo at least the sloops, if not also Lamour Piquet, while it tried to fight off the 2 coastal defence ships. So it could have gone very, very differently, but it does emphasise that, at this point, the element of surprise when your enemy is powered down, essentially, is quite significant. Matt Osborne asks, I was stunned to learn recently that some Homo erectus fossils, see if that doesn't get this channel demonetised, have been discovered on the island of Flores in the Indonesian archipelago. This island was inaccessible by land for more than 1 million years and would have only been reached by crossing very deep water. Humans seem to have accessed Mediterranean islands throughout the Paleolithic. What do you make of the argument that human beings are a seafaring species, and that our primary tool set, i.e. watercraft, has been linked to our evolution as much as any spearhead or arrow point? For example, Neanderthals had ropes, the precursor technology for sailing. Could a Neanderthal have sailed across the Strait of Gibraltar too? Well, that does go a little bit back beyond the channel's normal remit, to the point that it probably involves the study of early human behaviour, which I'm not even sure what that study is even called. Anthropology, maybe? Whatever. You get the idea of what I'm talking about anyway. Now, an argument that humans are a seafaring species. Kind of. I would argue that humans are a species that is capable of seafaring, but technically that makes us amphibious, in the classical sense of the word. I would hesitate to say humans as a species are a seafaring type, because there are plenty of examples of tribes, nations, etc. in more recent times where they've come across the sea and gone, oh well, and just stayed on land. Sure, obviously, if they're coastal dwelling peoples, they will usually have fishing ships and coastal trade and everything, because being able to move things by sea is quite often quite useful for moving bulk goods. But even then, some tribes, nations, etc., didn't really get beyond that stage, and some of them didn't even have a particularly developed coastal industry. They had sort of fishing boats, the occasional boat for tootling up and down the coast, but very much in the realm of boats and not ships. And they didn't have a large scale, let's go over here and explore things, and large transport vessels and that kind of stuff. But equally, some tribes and or nations seem to have hit the coast and gone, that's mildly inconvenient, built a fleet and headed over the waters anyway. So, yeah, I don't think it's a species-wide trait, but there are certainly various human groups throughout history who have had a fairly strong either affinity for the sea or disregard for anything approaching what you might term an obstacle. And I have a feeling, again, well outside the channel's remit, so take this with a truckload of salt, but my personal feeling is that generally whether or not humans became seafaring probably had more to do with what pressures they were facing on land than a natural inclination toward the sea, because the sea, as we've said multiple times before, is a cruel and vicious place. It really, really likes to kill you. And outside of earthquakes, the ground usually doesn't. So for anyone who, enjoys life, the sea is probably not somewhere you want to be on a regular basis, outside of occasional short-range forays for collecting fish and so forth. So if a people have no particular pressing need or concern about pressures on encroaching other tribes of other people, or resource shortages, inclement weather, etc., they're probably just going to stay where they are. Coastal regions are usually quite fertile, quite nice, so exploit the local environment, but don't really bother going anywhere else. Whereas if you have hostile people coming to kill you, really poor weather, bad harvest, food shortages, could be simple population pressure, that's what started a lot of the Norse expansions, then at that point, well, I can't go anywhere on land because these problems are all over the place, relatively speaking, to where you are locally. But I could go out to sea. You'd probably be vaguely aware that, well, you will know that there is land further up and down the coast, and by going by sea, you can bypass all the horrible other people who are trying to stab you or nick all your food. And it's probably a lot quicker than walking and a lot more comfortable. And if you're aware of islands and other lands beyond the horizon, then that's even more hope for a new beginning and a new start. And so off you would go. Now, you would, of course, have the curious types who would just go, oh, well, we've seen everything here on our walks from the last time we left our village, town, or city. Let's just keep going. But I suspect they're going to be rather in the minority. I suspect the majority of human seafaring, at least in the early period of history, was due to pressures on land, which made them not want to stay in that area. Meatwad asks, in books such as Battleship Commander and the Pacific War, it's stated that Halsey was warned the navigation lights in the San Bernardino Strait had been lit, and this should have been a sign of impending trouble. How did the navigation lights work, and was this an important clue of Kurita's movements? So this all comes down to the fact you've got to remember that the Battle of Leyte Gulf took place in the early stages of the US invasion of the Philippines, or liberation of the Philippines, counter-invasion of the Philippines, whatever you want to call it. The point is, the Philippines at this point were under Japanese control. That included, notionally, the San Bernardino Strait. And the San Bernardino Strait, as most other straits are, is a passage between two areas of land, and therefore, if you stray off the beaten course, you're likely to end up either aground on that land or being ripped open by rocks or various other interesting fates that happen when ships go into shallow water, because rock is an unforgiving thing when you hit it. So there are safe channels through the strait. Those will be marked out by buoys. However, during the night, or fog, or basically any weather condition that isn't brilliant daylight, you're not going to see them. So they're also fitted with navigation lights. However, obviously, if the Japanese, who control the strait, aren't planning to send any ships down the strait, then why would you leave the lights on so the Americans can see how to get through the strait? So navigation lights are switched off. And this isn't just about the surface ships, it's also about the possibility of American submarines trying to transit the straits. So kind of like the blackout that the British used during the Blitz to try and make German bombers' lives a bit more difficult when it came to finding London. Switching off the navigation lights on the San Bernardino Strait was designed to make it much harder for American ships to use the strait. And then obviously if the Japanese wanted to use the strait, then they would need to switch the lights on so that they could navigate through it at night. Thus, given that the lights were normally off, if the lights are suddenly discovered to have been switched on, there's usually only one reason for that, and that is a Japanese surface force of some description is planning to transit the straits at a time when having those lights switched on would be useful, i.e. nighttime. And so, yeah, it was a fairly important clue as to Japanese intentions, because it told anyone who was interpreting it properly, i.e. Halsey should have done this, that the Japanese were planning to transit the San Bernardino Straits very, very soon, which, given all the intel and scouting reports he had about the various Japanese forces that were heading towards Leyte Gulf, it doesn't take a genius to put two and two together and go, maybe they're going to be sending someone through. Maybe I should have something in place to stop them. Kra F1 asks, given the focus on commerce raiding during World War II, would the construction of more 15-inch armed Scharnhorsts have been a better alternative compared to the two Bismarcks? Would this have resulted in more ships built quicker than what happened historically? Now, we do have to be a bit cautious with this, because when you look at what was planned for the refit of Gneisenau, there was a bow extension involved, etc. So that might have made the construction of the ships a little bit longer. But overall, the Scharnhorst are definitely a far faster vessel to construct. And you could argue as well that, if they're building repeats or slightly modified versions, it's going to be easier to build them because, they'll be quicker. They know roughly how everything goes together. They can order repeat items. They'll probably build them with an Atlantic bow from the start, etc., etc., etc. So, there's a reasonable argument, I think, to be made for suggesting that the build times of modified 15-inch Scharnhorst would probably be similar-ish, or at least close to the build times of the original Scharnhorsts, assuming, of course, they ordered the long lead items in time. Now, when you look at German shipbuilding of large capital ships in the run-up to World War II, one of the things they are incredibly short of is large slipways. So a lot of the stuff is delayed or is built at the time that it is built, like, say, the Graf Zeppelin, when there's a slipway available because they've just chucked a hole down the way. Now, in that respect, when you look at the two Scharnhorsts, approximately speaking, they take about a year and a half from keel laying to hull launch, averaged. And approximately speaking, the Bismarcks take about 2.5 years from their keels being laid to being launched. Now, of course, when you look at the launch dates and the locations of build, you realise that the two Bismarcks are being built in different locations to the Scharnhorsts because they're being constructed simultaneously. So Scharnhorst is at Kriegsmarinewerft in Wilhelmshaven, Gneisenau's at Deutsche Werk in Kiel, Bismarck is at Blom und Voss in Hamburg. Now, granted, Tirpitz is built in the same yard as Scharnhorst, but there are a couple of other yards around, because the Germans were building, obviously, 2 Graf Zeppelins, plus Bismarck and Tirpitz, and so on. So, if the Germans had decided we're just going to do repeat Scharnhorsts with 15-inch guns instead of the Bismarcks and the Graf Zeppelins, then they could have had 4 building simultaneously, Deutsche Werk, Kriegsmarinewerft, Blom und Voss and Germania Werft, and then once Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, the first 2, are launched, they could start building another 2 at those 2 yards in 1936. Those hull at very late 1936, to be fair, so you might as well call it early 1937, at which point those hulls would be hitting the water in the middle of 1938. So, assuming that someone can magic up the money and resources for all of this, in terms of sheer time, there's theoretically time available to complete those 6 vessels either immediately before or immediately after the outbreak of World War II, i.e. The last 3 probably would be fitting out in the latter stages of fitting out at the time that war was declared, so they will be completed. There's a little bit of a question that would hang over the second pair, i.e. the first 2 15-inch armed ships, because if they're laid down in place of Bismarck and one of the carriers, they're probably not hitting the water until late 37, early 38. Again, assuming you have a magical money tree, you could then argue, well, if they lay down new hulls immediately, then those hulls will launch at the kind of mid-1939, i.e. before World War II starts, which is true, but then they're going to take somewhat longer to complete. The flip side, of course, being that Bismarck and Tirpitz launched in early to mid-1939, and they were eventually completed. So I guess it's not out of the question that they could therefore have had 8 Scharnhorsts, of which 6 were armed with 15-inch guns, in service in the early part of World War II, but it wouldn't all be simultaneous. You'd probably have 3, maybe 4 in service at the outbreak, with another 2 coming online fairly quickly in early 1940, and then the next 2 probably not coming online until very late 1940 or early 1941. But, 8 fast capital ships is a lot better than 4, and would have been a lot harder to track down, because combined they would have made a more powerful force than 2 Bismarcks, and if they split in multiple directions, they're harder to catch. The only caveat is, of course, it would be hilariously expensive, but possibly not too much more expensive, bearing in mind that the Germans had already set money aside for 2 carriers and 2 Bismarcks, and 15-inch Scharnhorst would almost certainly be cheaper than either. So they could definitely pay for the 6, so 2 11-inch and 4 15-inch, and between the money saved on not ordering Bismarcks and not ordering carriers, plus maybe throwing a little bit more at it, they might be able to afford the 7th and 8th vessels. Of course, the big problem then becomes finding the crew and the oil to get these things moving and keep them moving, but that's a completely separate matter. Reichsbeerminister asks, in the German language there is a word that describes a daring, reckless act that ends in a huge success and humiliates the opponent. I think this is how to pronounce it, Husarenstück. Are there any such acts in naval history from the age of sail to 1950, and could you name or describe 5? Well, there are quite a few. The Battle of Cape St. Vincent, particularly Nelson's actions within that, are notable, considering that the battle consisted of a Spanish fleet of 25 ships of the line, including numerous first-rates, versus 15 British ships of the line, including a grand total of 2 first-rates. Admittedly, the British then did have a bunch of second-rates, but when you look at the gun power, you realise very quickly that the British were not only outnumbered, they were also very heavily outgunned. At the time, the 2 first-rates, Britannia and Victory, had 100 guns apiece, and then they had the Prince George and Barfleur at 98 guns apiece, and Blenheim and Namur at 90 guns apiece. Whereas in terms of, the Spanish didn't have any second rates there, but the Spanish first rates, they had Purísima Concepción at 112 guns, Mexicano at 112 guns, Santissima Trinidad at that point rocking 130 guns, Salvador del Mundo with 112 guns, Conde de Regla at 112 guns, Principe de Asturias 112 guns, and San Jose at 112 guns. And then obviously everyone had 74 gun third rates, like they're going out of fashion. And so outnumbered, very heavily outgunned. In theory, just looking at it on paper, the Spanish should have won that battle relatively easily. Even if you take into account qualitative differences, it still should have been a very, very, very tough fight for the British. And then, thanks to Nelson basically headlong charging the Spanish vanguard, the battle ends with the Spanish having more dead than the British have wounded, and the Spanish have lost 4 ships of the line, including a couple of their very large ones, and the smaller British fleet has won a rather decisive battle. I mean, it's why John Jervis becomes the Earl of St. Vincent. Then, of course, you have the Italian frogmen, both in Gibraltar and in Alexandria, where an expenditure, as in the commitment of barely a dozen men, results in multiple ships being sunk or badly damaged, including a pair of modernised battleships. You also have, for example, Admiral Tegethoff's action against the Italian fleet at the Battle of Lissa, where he is, again, on paper, outgunned, out-technologied and outnumbered, but charges headlong into the recently formed Italian fleet and manages to get away with an outstanding victory. By many accounts, you could almost certainly classify Admiral Lee's intervention with Washington and South Dakota at the second night of the Battle of Guadalcanal as this kind of thing, because, well, as I've mentioned in that video on the battle and in the video about Admiral Lee, both sides kind of agreed that sending full-scale battleships, not the Congos, but full-scale battleships into confined waters, especially if you're the Americans, where it's nighttime and the enemy's known to have very good night fighting capabilities and an awful lot of incredibly powerful torpedoes at close range, yeah, that's reckless, but forced by circumstance, and of course ends with quite a significant success. And for the last one, you could probably actually name the Prussian fleet, or Northern German Confederation fleet, whatever you want to call it, basically the fleet that was in control of the people who were fighting against France in the Franco-Prussian War, because they were hideously outnumbered and outgunned by the French. Now, granted, they didn't take them on in a straight-up combat, because they knew that would be suicide, but they exploited the fact that the French were eventually forced to recall most of their navy, and then right towards the end of the war, you had the sight of German raiders operating off of the French coast and the German fleet operating near the French coast, well, such as the German fleet was, in direct defiance of the second largest navy on the planet. Now, obviously, the rebuilding efforts and the consolidation of the French armed forces on land also contributed to it, but that act by the German ships was a significant portion in the debates of the later 1870s on why the French Navy would get less money, and this kind of marks the point at which France starts to decline as a naval power, because prior to that, and indeed for a little bit more of the 1870s, France is the second largest naval power, and then between budget cuts and heading over to the Jeune École, France starts to decline more and more rapidly and gets overhauled or equaled by various other powers, including, of course, Germany, but also Russia, Japan, and the United States, such that by the time you get to World War One, France is a fair way down the pecking order. Colin Johnson asks, it's 1934 and you're given authority to get HMS Hood into Drydock for her modernisation so that she'll be ready for World War II. However, to make this happen, one of the capital ships that was historically modernised will have to miss out. Do you take this offer? And if so, which ship goes unmodernised? I would definitely take up the offer, but, obviously since I'm using hindsight, I would look and consider what the wartime records of the ships are. Obviously, back in 1934, I wouldn't know this, but, if I, as Drag, am able to make this decision, Renown, definitely not sacrificing her modernisation. She acts as a very, very useful ship throughout the war, gets into quite a few actions. Warspite, does any more need to be said? She's definitely still getting a modernisation. Valiant, I would also keep, because although she does less than Renown and Warspite, she still is involved in Matapan. However, that leaves one option, which is HMS Queen Elizabeth herself. And I would choose her simply for the fact that, obviously, again, using hindsight, her wartime record shows she didn't get involved in any significant major battles, unlike basically everybody else. She had quite a lot of useful supporting roles, but those supporting roles could arguably have been done by her in a slightly less modernised state. So, yeah, Queen Elizabeth doesn't get her modernisation, in exchange for which Hood does get her modernisation, and then, therefore, hopefully survives the Battle of Denmark Strait, at which point the Royal Navy has a pretty well protected, after modernisation, very capable fast battleship, which could be very, very useful in future operations. Blacksmith Panzer asks, could you briefly talk about and describe the Battle of Sinop in 1853? I've heard it was one of the first times explosive shells were used in combat, and if that is true, how large of an impact did they play in the battle? And would you happen to know any good sources for info on the battle and the larger Crimean War? So, two books from my library that I can confirm are quite good for the naval side of the Crimean War. More generally would be Before the Ironclad by D.K. Brown. It is part of his series on warship, particularly British warship development. So it doesn't cover the Crimean War exclusively, but it does a fair bit of detail about it. And then also, if you can find a copy, The Last Sailing Battle Fleet by Andrew Lambert. And more widely, Andrew Lambert Professor Andrew Lambert has also published the Crimean War British Grand Strategy Against Russia, which still maintains quite a bit of the naval focus, although obviously it talks about the land warfare a bit as well. So those would be excellent works to look at from the naval side of things. But in regards to the Battle of Sinop, yes, it is the first major battle at sea where shell-firing guns are deployed in large numbers, and yes, that doesn't do the Ottoman ships any favours whatsoever. They are completely crushed. However, you do always have to take things with a little bit of caution when people talk about revolutionary things, because, yes, it was a completely crushing victory. Yes, there were slightly more Ottoman vessels than Russian vessels. However, when you look at the particular vessels involved, if you ignore corvettes and other ships of, basically 5th and 6th rate levels of firepower, because as we already know, those kinds of ships just usually tend to die horribly in a straight-up fight, the Ottomans had only frigates. So they had 2 44-gun frigates, a 54-gun frigate, a 56-gun frigate, a 58-gun frigate, a 60-gun frigate, and a 62-gun frigate. Now, fair enough, that's actually, a few of them are kind of 4th-rate style frigates, but that is the sum total of their fleet. The biggest ship they have is a 62-gun vessel. The Russians show up with 3 120-gun first rates and 3 84-gun third-rate-ish ships, pushing second rates, and a single 54-gun frigate and a 44-gun frigate. So even if this had been just a purely conventional age of sail engagement using solid shot, a collection of what are effectively 4th rates facing off against 3 large first rates and 3 large second rates, that was always going to end badly for the Ottomans, regardless of the fact, in addition, that the Ottoman fleet was basically caught at anchor. So the fact that shell guns were involved just made what would have been an overwhelming victory anyway even more overwhelming. So for reference, for those of you who are curious, obviously it's the start of the Crimean War. The Russians have identified that the Turkish fleet is at Sinop. They've got a blockade going. They combine 2 squadrons, so the 84 gunners and the 120 gunners and all the various ancillary followers, and rather cleverly they sailed their fleet in a formation such they have 2 lines of vessels, but the lines are staggered so that you have overlapping fields of fire. They can fire between the gaps of the near side vessels. And although the Turks have coastal defences, the Russians position their vessels such that the coastal defences are on the other side of the moored Turkish ships. So if the coastal defences fire on the Russians, then they risk hitting their own vessels. And it's, pretty decisive. The entire Ottoman fleet, bar 1 small steam paddle frigate, is destroyed. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, I've always thought the quintessential example of a lack of clarity surrounding the definition of a battlecruiser is the fact that 70% of people who can use poop deck and spithead in a sentence without laughing seem to opine that Hood is a battlecruiser, whilst none designate Vanguard as such. Yet, aside from underwater protection, the 2 ships are remarkably similar. Any opinion as to why this is? I think it's a few reasons. One thing is that the Royal Navy always classified Hood as a battlecruiser, so she's referred to in all these documents as a battlecruiser. And to be fair, as originally designed, she very definitely was a battlecruiser. She had a sort of 9-inch armour. The fact that she was then taken back in, redeveloped, and like the lessons of Jutland, given more protection, and then we get the Hood that we all know. Because she had originally been built and classified as a battlecruiser, she retained that designation, and as we've discussed before as well, the Royal Navy treated any fast capital ship that had a speed above 25 knots as a battlecruiser, period, at that point, regardless of anything else. And all of that leads to the point, as we said before, the Royal Navy always called her a battlecruiser, so everyone calls her a battlecruiser, which is fair enough. You can call her that. She's just a very well-protected battlecruiser, relatively speaking. The fact that she ticks all the boxes for a fast battleship is another matter entirely. Then you get to Vanguard, and Vanguard, at least by the time she's actually built and brought into commission, is described flat out as a battleship after some initial dalliances with the term fully armoured battlecruiser. And she is a little bit, well, a fair bit better protected than Hood was. But yeah, otherwise, appearance-wise, a theoretical refit Hood and a Vanguard actually do look incredibly similar. They have roughly the same guns. In fact, they have exactly the same guns, just Vanguard's more modernised. As I say, Vanguard has somewhat greater protection in belt armour and obviously better deck armour, although a refitted Hood would be much closer to her in those values. And they have, similar speed, etc., etc. So, yeah, I think it's basically just nomenclature inertia. The fact that Hood, although, as we said, it ticks all the boxes for a fast battleship, was just always called a battlecruiser in life. And so that has continued, which is perfectly acceptable. Whereas Vanguard's designation, once she was in service, was always battleship. So people were going, well, okay, that's what they were called, so that's what we're going to call them. But this is why when I did the video on what is and isn't a battlecruiser, it is so difficult to nail it down because everybody has slightly different names for what's effectively the same ship. While everyone says, yeah, okay, fine, the Lexington class of battlecruisers, shorthand, but the US Navy had the CC designation for them. For the Germans, initially, what everyone would call battlecruisers, so Von der Tann, Lützow, etc., were originally large cruisers. It's not something like a battleship that has a very long, rather defined meaning. It's a loose term that defines a certain type of vessel, but no one sat down and come up with an internationally agreed definition for one. Alternate historian Turtleduck asks, did ammunition ships carry torpedoes for their nation's destroyers and cruisers to be restocked at sea, or did those ships have to go back to port to restock their torpedoes? So ammunition ships did carry spare torpedoes. As you can see here, this is a German Milchau submarine, or Milchkuh submarine, maybe? And you can see they're preparing a reload torpedo to be transferred to a more regular U-boat. Now, obviously, this is not a destroyer or cruiser. However, both vessels are considerably smaller. So the U-boat is considerably smaller than the average destroyer, and the resupply sub is considerably smaller than the average ammunition and resupply vessel. And the fact that they're able to do this transfer at sea, well, that kind of tells you that, yes, it is entirely possible for an ammunition ship to restock and resupply torpedoes to cruisers or destroyers at sea as well. There is one limitation which doesn't attend to this kind of thing, which is, of course, that the U-boats and other submarines have hatches specifically designed to accept torpedo reloads, and they're not going straight into the tubes, whereas a destroyer or cruiser, unless it's a Japanese destroyer, generally will need to have the torpedoes placed directly into the launcher tubes, which is a slightly more delicate operation. So, yes, you can restock torpedoes on destroyers and cruisers at sea. It is, however, a little bit fraught, so they would prefer to restock them in port. But, of course, the balance of that is that you can get a ammunition supply ship in calm waters or in a harbour or a little atoll or something where you can effectively recreate dockside sea conditions without actually being dockside, and as long as that ammunition ship has a crane or two that's capable of lifting the torpedoes, it is entirely possible to restock away from port. Graham William Kidd asks, where is the famed Drydock question list in Excel? I've looked on Patreon, Drac.com and Discord, but I can't find it. Where is it? So on the website, drakkenfell.co.uk, if you go to the channel tab, and then you'll find at the bottom of the text that's on that page, there is a link to the Excel document, although I do need to update that because that Excel document is almost now, it's 98 episodes short. So yeah, I do need to update that. Apologies for that. There is a slightly more up-to-date version on Patreon under the greetings to post to everybody, the pinned one. So it's there as well in a link. But again, that is a little bit behind the times. I actually do need to update both of those. As for where it is on Discord, I genuinely cannot remember. It's somewhere, but the other two places will have slightly out-of-date list, but hopefully over the next week or so I'll be able to update them. If the gods wanted us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh look, mead, a username I thoroughly agree with, by the way, asks, in Drydock 203, in the question about how a smaller navy would get a larger navy to take them seriously, one of the ways was to go hull down in a defensible position and hope the enemy came to you. You mentioned this almost worked for the Danish at Copenhagen. I did say Dutch in that episode. I deeply apologise to all Danish listeners. It should have been Danish, because obviously that's where Copenhagen is, in Denmark. And the question goes on. And you said that if it hadn't been for Nelson, who didn't really care, it might have worked. Can you elaborate on this? Yes, so the Danish Navy at Copenhagen had put together, with the forces they had available to them as a smaller navy, near enough the perfect defensive position. There were relatively restricted waters to get into the harbour. They'd taken older ships that were no longer serviceable and turned them into floating gun batteries. The forts were present as well, i.e. more fixed coastal defences, and they'd lined up their own serviceable warships. So they'd concentrated as much firepower as possible into basically a kill box where only a limited number of enemy ships could come, and those ships, as I said, would be more confined by the waters, which in theory they wouldn't know as well as the Danes themselves. And between, the gun platforms, the ships, and the coastal fortifications, in theory, you should have been able to knock back any attacking fleet. And let's face it, the British did come in with a fairly powerful force. Now, granted, the 2 second rates stayed in reserve, but there were a lot of third rates there, as well as a bunch of bomb ships. Now, the problem was basically that the damage that Nelson's forces were taking, along with, a couple of ships being grounded, was fairly considerable, and under the standards of the day, he would have been well within his rights to withdraw, having done a fairly decent job of shooting things up. And that's one of the reasons why Admiral Parker in the reserve actually sent the signal, giving Nelson an excuse to leave if he had to. But Nelson just basically said, no, I'm going to sit here and continue firing. And it was a bit touch and go for a little while, but eventually the number of guns and the training of the British gunners would win out and just about bring Nelson a victory. And this represents the fundamental problem of smaller forces. If you don't have the firepower to flat out destroy someone who comes after you, then you have to offer the hardest possible target. The Danes did that, and in 95% of circumstances where an enemy fleet attacked them, they probably would have driven them off. It's just that if your opponent attacks with a superior fleet and they just decide, I'm staying here and I'm winning regardless of anything else, in a war of attrition, the smaller force will generally lose against the larger one, at least in times of things like the Age of Sail. When you get into the 20th century and you have things like torpedoes floating around, then things get a little bit more dicey, but such is life. Andrew Dederer asks, while the Royal Navy enjoyed a certain amount of patronage, the bulk of captains seem to have been overwhelmingly from the gentry or just below. This might be a step up also from the US Navy, but seems much more common than European navies, where command of any type seemed to demand high noble blood. Was this sociological or practical, with the Royal Navy being large and the English nobility small? There are a number of factors that go into why the Royal Navy seems to take its officers for a good chunk of the Age of Sail period from, and to be honest, even into this Age of Steam and Steel, from this kind of upper middle to lower upper class zone. Part of it, as you say, is yes, the Royal Navy is proportional to the population of the country, quite large for most of that period. and the nobility are relatively small, considering that the population also is relatively small compared to something like France. So with the French or Spanish Navy with a smaller number of ships and a larger noble population, it's much, much easier to make requirements that you have to be, your peerage must be at least this high to command this ship, kind of thing. You also, for the Royal Navy, had a number of other strongly influencing factors. Now, theoretically, in any navy, you could rise through the ranks into high command just through merit, but practically speaking, this could be very difficult, depending on, obviously, the navy in question. But as I said, the Royal Navy had a couple of additional influencing factors. Firstly was the fact that in its earlier days as an official force, kind of late Tudor period, etc., there were quite a number of, if not lower class, but lower than nobility class captains and other accomplished sailors who put themselves quite forward in the limelight, even if they weren't strictly always Royal Navy sailors, people like Francis Drake, John Hawkins, Frobisher, etc. So there was a bit more of this idea of, okay, someone from slightly lower down the social hierarchy can command, and a lot of arguments were settled, particularly in Drake's voyage around the world, where you had something of the holdover from the old school of, oh, well, I'm a noble, therefore I'm in command because my social status says that I'm better than you, as opposed to, you're the person who's actually in charge of the expedition and knows a lot more about sailing. That was Thomas Doughty, and then Drake beheaded him, which rather put a definite underscore under the captain's word is law, regardless of how blue your blood might be. And then, once you get through into the middle of the Stuart period, you have, of course, the period of the Commonwealth or Republic Navy under Cromwell. And during that period, of course, people who had come up the ranks in the parliamentarian side, who, again, had very little actual noble blood in them, if any, were given command and proved themselves once again to be particularly able. Whereas the Spanish and French navies didn't experience either of these kind of two disruptive influences for quite some considerable time. In the Age of Sail, the Spanish Navy didn't, and in the French case, their big disruption came with the Revolution, where you just had kill everybody who doesn't agree with the Revolution, which was a bit unfortunate for their overall effectiveness. Whereas in the outcome of the English Civil War, some noble officers just spent the time fighting with Prince Rupert on the royalist side. Others were just, okay, fine, I guess we're fighting for Parliament now. And others just retired, so they were able to come back in again when the monarch came back and took over. So the dilution of strength in the Royal Navy's officer corps was nothing like as close. Plus, of course, as I say, they had very able seamen like Blake and Monk coming up the ranks. And the fact that this sort of slightly lower class level of people being commanders had already been somewhat embedded in the Navy anyway. And then at the lower boundaries of things, you had the fact that if you were going to start service as a midshipman in your very early teens, you were expected to have a certain degree of knowledge already, the ability to read and write, amongst other things. And that put to a certain degree a lower boundary on people's capabilities, because of course there was no universal schooling back then, so your family had to have a degree of money in order to give you an education, even if it was what we might consider today to be a primary school education before you went into the Navy. And therefore that as I said, set a kind of a lower bound for most people who could actually enter the officer track of the Royal Navy. The other element to it was that within the, again, relatively small core of the nobility of Britain, if you were a first son, you were expected to inherit your father's titles, etc. So if you were a first and only son going into the Navy, a relatively high-risk occupation would not be viewed particularly favourably. Also, you're expected to complete a much broader education, so what we today would recognise as a high school and then university levels of education, which would take place at exactly the time when you should be, if as far as the Navy was concerned, a midshipman and then a lieutenant. So they were the upper echelons of nobility gradually ruled themselves out as eligible for sea command, especially once the lieutenant's examinations were brought into play in the late 17th century. And so what you would end up with is this mixture of the very occasional high-born noble who really, really wanted to be at sea, third and fourth and so forth sons of higher nobility, but the fact that they were third or fourth sons meant they themselves didn't carry usually titles, or they carried lesser titles. They were very much lower down the ranks of the pecking order than the future Duke of Norfolk or something like that. And even then, they were relatively rare sights. And then you've got obviously the gentry, as it were, the upper middle and lower upper classes, which could supply educated boys, but also without having the pressures of the upper nobility, could supply them at a time that the Royal Navy wanted to start shaping them into decent midshipmen. And then, of course, if you manage to pick up a half-decent education, either just by osmosis or by luck, and you're part of the lower ranks, then in theory you could move over to being a commissioned officer as well. And that's it for part 1. So join us again when we head over to part 2. Video release in a couple of hours, probably an hour or two after you hearing this, assuming you've watched at the time of release, but nevertheless, 208 part B coming up soon.